we are contemplating the breadth of what we understand as the what's in the multimodal transportation plan. It's been a cumulative effort over many years. So that's the purpose of this. We need to, if we're going to make an educated decision on this moving forward, we need to start from a common understanding, and that's why we are here today. So I would like to note once again, there is an additional opportunity for public comment on this. Well, first of all, I remind everyone, if there's anyone new in the room, you can fill out a question or a public comment card. There's a sheet at the front table by the door. You can hand it to the chief or to city staff up front here, and we can get your question answered. There will also be an additional opportunity for public comment when the proposed amendment is presented to council for consideration at their May 3rd, 2023 regular meeting. And that will be a standard public comment process. At this time, I will yield the floor to Infrastructure and Development Services Manager, Amanda Wilson. Take it away, Amanda.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, and good evening, Council. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent. And good evening to everyone in the public. It's really great to see so many people in attendance tonight. We'll get going here. So as the mayor mentioned, really the purpose of this presentation this evening, and it is a long one, I will note, is to enhance understanding regarding figure 23, which is that east-west connection, specifically the long-term plan. It's a concept included in the city's adopted multimodal transportation plan, one I'm sure pretty much everyone in the room has seen. The agenda this evening is broken out into really 4 different categories, followed by questions and answers at the end. Those 4 categories are going to be split up as follows. The first part will be regarding the context of the master plan. So how we got to this master plan, what it includes and what it doesn't include, as well as a brief history on US 2. The mayor mentioned it's been a long time coming over the last 15 plus years of planning for that corridor. So we're going to make sure we have a common understanding as far as the history goes. And then we're also going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the more technical data and simulations as well. So simulations are looking at how vehicles are actually moving through our jurisdiction based upon volume of traffic. So we'll get into that. It's a little bit like a video game. So hopefully that'll be of interest to folks. And then last, but certainly not least, we'll take a deeper dive into that long-term east-west connection and hopefully bring it all home. Before we take a dive into the master plan itself, I wanted to give an explanation as to where the master plan fits into the overall aspect of planning. So we do a lot of plans at the city, and it's not unique to the city of Sandpoint. All jurisdictions are following a similar process. So this image is intended to reflect that we take values from the community and we turn those into priorities. And from priorities, we get into planning and finally into implementation. So each of our projects is somewhere in one of those various phases. And it begins with the strategic plan. We talk a lot about the comprehensive plan, and then we dive into our master plans. Those master plans then feed into a capital improvement plan, which is typically a 6-year window, and then ultimately get into annual budgets and projects where we're starting to approve contracts for design services and construction services. As noted there in the yellow, as many of you in the room know, our comprehensive plan is currently being updated. It was adopted in 2009, and we are actively seeking public engagement for that effort. This is a quick snapshot of our strategic plan, which we previously went to the public and city council with in great detail. So I won't read the slide to you, but wanted you to have a glimpse as to its reference. As I mentioned, the comprehensive plan, how that fits in is it's really a 20-year vision by and for the community. And fundamentally, it helps shape our major decisions as to where and how the city may grow. On the right-hand side there, it notes why we do a comprehensive plan. And I'll let you just take a moment to read that.
Excuse me, Amanda.
Yes.
Can you show us just your slideshow view? We're seeing your whole computer screen. I think it's a little busy.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you.
It might just be me, but
Appreciate that.
No, I had intended to show the slideshow, so thank you.
You always do, so thank you.
Let's see if I can catch up with myself there. I really appreciate you pausing me. Okay, I think we're back on track. So what is multimodal? Our multimodal transportation master plan. The use of the word multimodal, as many of you are aware, is really about all users. So simply put, it relates to the many ways in which people travel through the community. That includes pedestrians, bicycles, motorists, freight, deliveries, as well as riding transit. Our multimodal plan, while it doesn't state it there, also talks about watercraft and that's a use within our area as well, which is pretty unique. And the city's complete streets, in the yellow there on the right-hand side, our complete streets policy that City Council put into place via resolution in 2011 actually requires that we consider all users. So it's not just at a planning level from a master plan perspective, it's actually a policy that the Pedestrian and Bicycle Advisory Committee really helped to move forward and solidify with City Council. So on the right-hand side, I want to take a second to introduce our team on this multimodal transportation master planning effort. OTAC was the lead consultant, and they partnered with Fair and Pierce, which is a transportation planning consultant based in Utah. And in the room this evening, we have Preston Stinger. He is a professional transportation planner. And we're kind of backwards this evening. Preston's normally with us online and I'm there in person. We're switched. I'm currently at a conference here in Seattle about wastewater and implementing those projects to replace our wastewater plant. That said, Preston has been involved in our planning efforts related to transportation for going on 2.5 years now. And he continues to be involved in our reviews of private development. At our February 1st meeting, I gave a pretty lengthy introduction to Preston, so I won't do that, but I wanted you to know he's in the room this evening sitting next to Jennifer, and will be providing about half of this presentation with me. So we're going to bounce back and forth between the two of us. So the overview of the intent with the multimodal plan is that it's really taking a look at all the information and culminating it into a single plan. So that includes past plans, it includes analysis, community and stakeholder input, as well as data, and then the resulting strategies of how we're going to move forward over the next 20 years. And again, it's a multimodal plan. Sometimes the use of the word multimodal, people think that that means pedestrians and bicycles, but multimodal again means all users. What's in the multimodal plan? The contents that are listed on the left-hand side of the screen there are true for pretty much all of our master plans. We typically have a summary at the beginning. We talk about the process that includes the public engagement, as well as what information went into the planning document. We usually do vision and goals. The goals feed the objectives. So the goals are what, and the objectives are how we want to accomplish the priorities and the vision of the community. And then number 4, existing conditions and analysis. That starts to get into the technical component of the plan. And then that moves forward usually into some select concept solutions. So we don't provide necessarily a concept for everything that's included in the plan, but definitely those areas where we've heard the most amount of concerns and desires for solutions. And then we have an overarching capital improvement plan, which is again looking at a 20-year horizon. And then last but not least, how may we go about funding some of these different projects? Overall, the planning process in this slide is true to all of our planning efforts, regardless of if it's transportation or arts and culture or parks and recreation. We begin with public input. And actually, before we have a conversation with anyone, we actually start with reading and having our consultants read and understand what the public previously said. So we have a lot of prior plans that a significant amount of public engagement went into, and taking that input and recognizing how it may still be relevant today. So that's the first box that you see there. And then moving forward, what does the public say about our current conditions, and what is the existing data that we have to come forward through this planning effort? So then in moving forward to your right, the public input continues when we start to engage on what are the concerns from the public, what are the issues that they're most concerned about, and what are the solutions that they would like to see move forward. So we take all of that information, and our consultant team moves forward with doing an analysis on, we know what today is now, what do we think the future is going to look like from a data perspective? And then moving that forward to, okay, given what we know from the community, what the data is telling us, what are some technical solutions that could contribute to these concerns? And then we go back to the community and we ask, what do you think of these potential solutions and these technical solutions? And we take that feedback and then we incorporate it into the final request for an adoption of a plan. So what planning efforts went into this multimodal plan specifically? We have here a slide pulled directly from our multimodal transportation plan, and it's just an overall image of what's actually articulated in a number of pages within the plan. It's an image showing that we started the engagement in the fall of 2019 until ultimately it was adopted in the spring of 2021. On the bottom of the screen, you can see the various types of engagement efforts that occurred throughout the process. So we had public engagement events. This slide does not list all of them. It merely is highlighting some of the key series that went throughout the process. So that includes the public survey that went out initially. And we also had a series of workshops in February of 2020. We went to the keg pole and had a booth at the keg pole in 2020. We also did a pedestrian priority network workshop session and a variety of public meetings in February of 21. We had multiple presentations to City Council. We had a few presentations to Planning and Zoning as well. And then those blue dots are representing steering committee and coordination teams. The blue dots represent what we've historically primarily focused on, which is having a steering committee through a planning process that really helps see that planning process throughout. So they're engaged right at the beginning and they're reviewing the document at every one of those really critical milestones. And so while we had steering committees on this particular planning effort, we intended very strategically to broaden the input by having additional workshops. And I have a few more slides on that I'll show you this evening. So who was involved? There's a lot more people that were involved than are represented on this slide, but I wanted to just take a moment to note that we did have an agency coordination team. So that included 10 individuals from various agencies, as you would expect: ITD, Bonner County Road and Bridge, the school district, the railroad, the airport spot, of course, and then the Independent Highway District. And then we also had another 15 individuals that were invited to attend right from the beginning, called our community steering team. So each one of these individuals brought a different element to the table and a different perspective. And then, as I noted earlier, these two teams were engaged throughout the process. However, we also had other specific invites and more focus groups. So we had an effort that we'll talk a little bit about called the Trend Lab Plus, which is looking at what do we think our community is going to function and look like as it relates to transportation in the future, as in way in the future. How will technology impact our ways in which we move throughout our community? Will our deliveries be via air? So it was trying to get feedback from the community about where we think we'll be in the future as it relates to transportation. So we invited 35 individuals to attend, and that included the mayor, some council members, the public, and then various business owners as well. We had a series on sidewalk network connectivity, and we invited a total of 20 attendees to that workshop, or workshops, I'm sorry, there were a couple of them. And I listed a few of the names. It doesn't represent all of them, but I know there's a couple folks I saw in the audience that are listed there. And moving forward, we also had a trucking focus group. So Lighthouse hosted a meeting with those individuals listed there to really focus on how trucks function through town and get their feedback specifically. So it was a pretty broad spectrum of individuals that participated throughout the process. A lot of this was available online. We also had two teams. I'll move forward to my next slide here. So our invitation, this is just a snapshot from that invitation to engage the coordination team and what we were asking them to provide input on. This was the slide I was thinking was next. So in addition to those two teams that we noted were engaged throughout the process, it was really important, and I commend our consultants for focusing on the perspective of youth. We also heard that from council when we launched this effort to not just focus on adults, but what do our youth think about our transportation system? How are they using it? What do they think about the future? So I know our consultants really enjoyed that effort as well. So what did we do specific to the East-West connection concept? How did we inform the community about this potential concept? The answer is in a number of ways. So we kicked it off actually starting with the short-term solution, which is figure 22 in the plan, with an online workshop on January 28th. We also had a really deep dive into this exact figure that's in front of you on February 11th of 21. Again, that was available online for anyone to participate in. We had a variety of social media and network newspaper coverage, the mayor's roundtable articles, as I mentioned earlier, the committee meetings, as well as presentations at planning and zoning, and 2 city council presentations prior to adoption. Very much appreciate all of the coverage within the reader. They did a great job of notifying everyone and assisting us with that they could participate in a conversation about the East-West. So part 1 there that's noted was scheduled to cover the East-West connection on January 28th. That's when we kicked it off. It was a 3-part series of a workshop. And while that was the effort related to the East-West connection prior to adoption, the engagement hasn't stopped. We just in 2022 have picked the conversation back up as we notified City Council in receiving a grant for an update to the urban area transportation plan. That included a variety of media coverage, as well as 2 City Council presentations to date, just on kicking it off and ways in which the community can engage. We did do an online survey, and then the image on the right-hand side is Crazy Days this summer. It was a very hot day. Actually, the board, ironically, that is up at Jeff Jones Square there that I'm pointing at is the East-West connection. So we had about 100 people participate in that effort and had some really good conversations that will ultimately feed into that urban area transportation plan. Also very much appreciate that the B participating in notifying the public of that engagement effort. While it wasn't a transit meeting, transit is light rail. We really, I think the public had a clear understanding that it was very much a transportation plan. This is a super fun slide. It just is highlighting all the different ways in which the B notified individuals through the 18-month planning process of how they could be involved in this transportation master planning effort. So these are all specific to transportation. It totals about 12 different articles in just the B alone. A search on the reader you'll find a similar result of about 12 to 15. The summary of conditions and data. So moving from that conversation around what public involvement fed into the multimodal plan, our consultants looked at a variety of data, and I'm actually going to take a breath of speaking. I'm going to turn this one over to you, Preston. Can you just very briefly highlight each one of those categories and what they are?
You bet. All right, so population trends and growth trends. So that is obviously population, our people. That is increases in our population growth based on birth rates, based on move-ins and so forth. Growth trends is related to population, but it's also related to land use growth. It's related to traffic growth. And there's not a one-to-one ratio either. Population and traffic growth are not equal. Right now, what we're seeing is population growth is increasing at a higher rate than the traffic growth is, but they're pretty well aligned as far as that goes. The public survey results, I know OTAC led that effort with the surveys and interviewing through the survey online, how people travel, how they like to travel, where are the issues they're seeing, and how often do they use certain modes of transportation. And all these things helped inform later improvement recommendations. The travel demand and operational analysis. So those are two different things, not to get too geeky here, but there's a travel demand model that the city has that has land use information, has population, has demographic information in there with future plans of what we project, what the city projects, what those land use projections will be. And based on that, it then uses census data to calculate what that increase in traffic will be and what routes they're going to take on your street system. So that's what overall, that's what a travel demand model does. That does need to be updated on a frequent basis, especially these days with how rapidly things are changing in the city. Operational analysis is what follows that. So after getting those projections of volumes, we then put that into a different traffic analysis tool that analyzes your grade level of operations at your intersections and how well those are functioning. And then simulations, there's oftentimes our tools have the ability to look at simulations, so look at cars moving through the system. So we can see not just from a calculation deterministic standpoint of what those equations equal, but looking at with your eyes, how things are moving around. And then also that's calculating behind the scenes what that delay is at your intersections. So it's nice to see both. You can see visually, but also the back end, the data behind it. Origin destinations, that's a way for us to tell how many people are coming in and out of town, from where they're coming from a geographic standpoint, how many are passing through town and not stopping, how many are passing through town and stopping, and so forth. And that's coming from a data source that we call Streetlight, that we purchased the data from. It's a third-party vendor that purchases data from cell phone companies. And it's also called location-based services. It's what the data is called, where they wipe the IDs of individuals and just give us the data of what that looks like. It's thousands of points on a map that we then analyze from an origin destination standpoint. And then the TrendLab Plus that Amanda introduced already, electronic pavement condition assessment. Amanda, you may have to help me on that one. I'm not a pavement expert, but I'll jump to the next one, existing conditions of sidewalks, which was also led by OTAC, but is evaluating our existing sidewalk system. Where are there gaps? What's the condition of those sidewalks? And where do we need improvements to fill those gaps and poor levels of sidewalk? Amanda, you want to talk about the pavement?
Absolutely. Thank you, Preston. Yeah, the electronic pavement condition assessment was a van actually that we contracted with to go in and do an electronic assessment of every block of street in the city. So subsurface conditions all the way to surface conditions. And the purpose of that is to help us use data to inform where and how we are improving our pavement. So that information contributed to our capital improvement plan specifically. Any questions on this slide before we move on from a data perspective?
No.
Okay.
Nope. We're going to continue on with the presentation. There were questions from the public will be addressed at the end.
This slide is just a summary of the cell phone data that Preston had mentioned. This is an image from our master plan. So a vision statement, such an important part of a document. So we have a vision statement in our strategic plan that feeds into as well the vision in our comprehensive plan, and that feeds into the visions that are also in all of our subsections of our master plans. So on the right-hand side, I highlighted what I think is a really, while the entire statement is very valuable, there's, I think, a key sentence here that's applicable to tonight's conversation, which is quality options. So having options through our various modes of travel is really critical to the economy, the livability of our community. As I mentioned earlier, the plan includes goals, and they are the what, as well as a number of objectives that goes with each one of these 10 goals in the plan. As we move forward with our comprehensive plan and how these two documents talk to each other, these goals go directly in that comprehensive plan. So as Amy, our city planner, has been bringing forward the conversation of the comprehensive plan, we keep checking back on all of these goals that are included in our master plans. So this serves as the draft of the goals that are in the comprehensive plan, specifically in the transportation chapter. So we keep checking back and forth on these. And I will say that as of at least recently, we're hearing that these goals still are a resounding support for these goals. And I think that they're high enough level goals that they are consistent as we move through time. They don't really change significantly because our values fundamentally haven't really changed over the last 15, 20 years. we as a community, and I'm preaching to the choir to everyone in the room, we've cared a really long time about pedestrians and bicycles, as well as how we have a safe environment, and we care about character within our community as it relates to our transportation system. That hasn't changed. As far as important factors driving the need, why are we improving multimodal? It is true, we have a long list of pavement that needs to be rehabbed and replaced, quite frankly. In fact, we're above average, not in the good way, regarding our backlog in the city of how much pavement needs to be replaced. So in addition to pavement, there's a variety of concerns within the community that need to be addressed through improvements, as well as we spoke earlier about the data that feeds into how we're growing as a community. So the need for our multimodal improvements in Sandpoint is really looking at that growth and recognizing that we are a hub for our region. We have a year-round tourism, obviously, and we are facing failing infrastructure, just like the rest of the nation. So when it comes to being a hub for the region, what that really means is that as the county seat, we're serving a lot of communities in the area. There's a lot of folks that work in Sandpoint that maybe don't live in Sandpoint. There are communities such as Dover that are not necessarily full service cities in the aspect of having multiple restaurants and grocery stores. So they're coming to Sandpoint for their services, as everyone in the room knows. So this is just really capturing that our role as a hub for the region isn't projected to change over time. And Preston, I'm going to turn this one over to you to kind of help explain how we go about achieving that goal of a balanced approach, and that not every corridor is everything to everyone, as we've said in the transportation plan, specific to those layers of the network.
You bet. So the kind of the standard transportation planning that we use is a layered network methodology. So that means you have a network of your transportation, or sorry, your truck. You have a network of vehicular, a network of your pedestrian, a network of your bicycle, and a network of your transit. So all of those layer on top of one another. And it doesn't mean all of those users are using the same corridors to do what they need to do. They have different corridors they need to utilize. For instance, trucks obviously aren't going to use every corridor in the city. They have designated routes. We want to make sure that those are hopefully not overlaying on top of heavy pedestrian or bicycle corridors. So once you layer those on top, then you have your full transportation network. We should probably also talk about how a street system works. There is a kind of transportation 101. There's a hierarchy of streets, and not every street serves the same purpose. We have local streets, which are kind of your neighborhood streets that have lots of access, slower speeds. And then you have collector streets that bridge that gap between the local and your arterials. They provide that access into your arterials and are a good feeder system. And then you have your arterials, and oftentimes you have different levels of arterials. You have minor arterials or major arterials, and sometimes called principal arterials, depending on how we want to classify it. The arterials tend to carry more traffic and usually at a higher speed and with less access, meaning there's less driveways, hopefully, on that. If there are lots of driveways, you tend to break down that system and they don't function as way they should. To have a good, healthy transportation system in your city, you need to have a mixture of all of those. You can't just have a bunch of local streets or neighborhood streets. That doesn't serve your system. You'd end up having a clogged system in many areas. And same thing, can't have multiple arterial streets. That's not healthy to live in. Nobody wants a whole bunch of traffic on every street. So a good system has a healthy mix of all of those, and they all feed off one another.
Thank you, Preston.
Yep.
So moving on through the plan to our concepts and capital improvement plan. As I mentioned earlier, a capital improvement plan is looking at a 20-year horizon with short, mid, and long term. So what you can expect for the short term, it's typically 1 to 5 years. Midterm is usually 6 to 10, and then long term is that 10 to 20-year vision. And short term are things that feed into our next annual budget, things we're intending to implement sooner than later. The mid and long term continue to be plans and concepts usually, As we get closer towards the end of that 5-year window, we start looking at design budgets for our midterm solutions and moving those projects forward. The multimodal plan specifically includes concepts, images, if you will, cartoons, for everything listed on the left-hand side there. And on page 6, I just wanted to call this out because I think it's super important. It's stated in the plan multiple times because of its level of importance, and that's that the concepts are cartoons. They show generally where and how, but I really appreciate our consultants noting that it's imperative that we proceed with additional community engagement and engineering to evolve these concepts. So that's why concepts change throughout time. They are initial concept, and depending on if they're in the short term, midterm, or long term, the level of detail varies within them as well. So key takeaways, these are snapshots from the plan itself, and I just highlighted there at the bottom in the middle, again, that the concepts provided are intended to serve as just the first step to determine what's a priority in our community and to move forward as we go about that planning effort as a guide for future community engagement and engineering, meaning it's the start of the conversation, not by any means the end. It also notes that the capital improvement plans total about $100 million in today's dollars, which today was in 2021 when this plan was adopted. So we have a lot of needs in our community, and it is very challenging to balance those needs and also obviously to find funding for all of them. I really appreciate that one of the key takeaways was, again, that complete streets policy. It is Appendix B. The complete resolution is Appendix B in the multimodal plan, just solidifying again that safe and convenient travel for all users is really important. And I, again, appreciate that it still holds true today, even though it was adopted over 10 years ago. Before adopting the transportation plan, we had a series of workshops to do exactly what we're doing tonight on every single concept. So the presentation that you're seeing tonight is an effort to take all of those workshops that we had and consolidate them into a 59 slide of a presentation. We posted on our website access to all of the planning documents. You could participate online in providing input at each one of those presentations at City Council and tell Council your feedback as community members to those concepts, as well as the contents overall. So that was on our website as a snapshot there, and then it wasn't ultimately adopted until May 5th of 2021. So as a summary, City Council again adopted this in May. And it serves as our only city transportation planning document that's actually supported by substantial data. So all other prior documents are purely or primarily based upon community input, which is huge and essential to the process. At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about that overarching process of planning. So it is critical. I will note that the 2009 Urban Area Transportation Plan that was adopted did include the ADT and level of service. So it did have some data contributing to it, but it was very car centric and just looking at the level of service and how much volume of vehicles we had. And then also the Downtown Streets Plan and Design Guide, which we'll talk more about this evening, was done concurrently with ITD doing data, the Idaho Transportation Department developing data and engineering concurrently with that community planning effort. So I would most certainly say that that document did have a fair bit of data that went that contributed into it. So while community input is essential in transportation, it's essential in every single planning document. Failure to consider the engineering and functionality side of things, as well as having a realistic implementation plan, it kind of gets us to that phrase that people hear a lot, which it's a plan that sits on the shelf. And so when we launched this multimodal transportation planning effort, the committee teams really strive that we don't want to do all of this work and it just be a plan that sits on the shelf. So we want to make sure that the implementation of the plan is really brought forward in a way that's realistic. So it does call, the multimodal plan does call, and I think it's super important that our community recognizes this, that it be updated every 5 to 10 years. So Preston mentioned that our travel demand and our operational analysis, it's time to update that. fiscal year 24, we'll be requesting additional funds for funds in that budget to go about updating that data again. And then the urban area transportation master planning effort that's underway, it's intended to incorporate the multimodal plan by appendix and any additional feedback that contributes through that process. So before I move on to the brief history of US 2, does City Council, Mr. Mayor, do we have any questions at this point for the past plan?
Council? No, please continue.
You were too fast. I didn't make a drink in time. So this slide begins the brief history of US 2. This is a snapshot from a presentation that ITD provided in 2013 to City Council. So in 96, the state purchased the railroad property in anticipation of a future project. So the railroad property, for those of you that may not know, follows the old rail alignment, which is adjacent to our community pathway, right behind Matchwood, if you will, that we have the free parking currently at. ITD owns those lots, and we have an agreement with ITD that we maintain it as a city and our citizens get to park there. So again, the purchase of those parking lots as we use them today was actually for a future expansion of US 2. So in 2008, the byway began, and in 2010, the city requested the curve development be moved forward so that we could get back our streets. We really wanted our streets in our downtown core. And to help support that effort, we initiated the 2011 Urban Renewal Agency, and that funding really helped us move forward with our concept study. And we have a couple images of that concept study in a bit. And in 2012, ITD put the project into their federal aid funding. And in 2012, they began that really detailed intersection analysis. So I want to talk a little bit about the phrase, the curve. It had nothing to do with a couplet or splitting traffic. It was really just the shape of that alignment. So the blue line that you see there is a bit of a curve between Cedar and Boyer. So that's where the curve got its branded name. Again, had nothing to actually do at the time with a couplet concept. And the reason I say that is because, again, the railroad right-of-way was purchased for the sake of providing US 2 at that location in its full alignment. So in the 90s, the intent was to expand US 2 in a fashion that's very similar to what we have today, that's north of Cedar Street. So that 5-lane section all the way through that corridor there, through those parking lots. That was the intent. And as we continue through the slide, you'll see that through that detailed analysis and extensive public engagement, on the left-hand side, you'll see what is known as the couplet. So this image is from our 2012, where the city adopted our downtown streets plan and design guide. So at that time, we, through that effort, really came out and said, we don't want what's north of Cedar Street all the way through that corridor. We want to split traffic up. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why here in a second. So the green actually has 2 couplets in it. A couplet, the highlighted green area, a couplet is splitting the directions of traffic. So we have northbound and southbound that is split. And then we also have a split between east and west. So in this image, the couplet on Church is that Church runs westbound in a single one-way. And then Pine Street is a one-way to the east. So again, the couplet concept was favored by the community in 2012. And that is the result of saying what we don't want is what's north of Cedar Street on US 2. So then how does a couplet come back together? In 2011 to 2013, the state and the city collaborated on progressing the design. So if I go back a few slides, in 2010, we said we want to move forward with the curve project, and we engaged the community in planning this effort. So again, engineering functionality has to go with that. So a detailed analysis on concepts specific to the intersection of US 2 and Boyer Avenue took place, and a variety of solutions were considered. So namely 3. There were 2 different roundabout solutions at that location that were analyzed, not just concept schematics, but they were actually modeled and engineered to see how they functioned on the system. And then a signal solution. So the criteria there that's in the box is a snapshot from, again, the ITD presentation. So we as a community agreed that all of those factors are important to us. And so when we're looking at any solution, we need to weight those criteria and then assign each solution a score. Ultimately, the signal scored the highest. And it scored the highest because, again, it's about a balanced approach. So if we were favoring, for example, costs, we might have come up with a different solution. Mobility of commerce may have weighed more heavily on one solution than the other. So it's really trying to compare apples to apples of what's important overall. And so I think what's really interesting to note that although the signal solution scored the highest at that time, the solution, alternative B, it was called, didn't change the alignment of the Boyer intersection and US 2. And as we'll talk a little bit more, that was one of our community's really big concerns. Not only did it impact Dubs, but we have a long list of safety concerns at this intersection today. And at our recent workshops over the last 3 to 5 years, we've heard a lot of feedback from people about site visibility at this location, how close the intersection of Pine and Boyer is to the highway there. And there's a lot of near misses because you think you can take a left or go north on Boyer and the signal turns and there you have it, you have a vehicle right on you. The way in which the community path comes in is really awkward. So this alternative B didn't really resolve those issues. We've had questions about impacting in a section 4 and what does that mean? So when there's federal funds involved, there are requirements that a state can't impact a park. They actually can't touch it. It's untouchable. So while we'll talk more about the city's solution, as a city, we have the right to put a street where a park is, but the state and FHWA restrict that. So they were limited as to how they could fit a solution into the existing footprint. While they can acquire private right-of-way or private property to become right-of-way, there's a lot of tools for them to do that. As a state, they can't touch our park. So again, just to really note there that the alignment didn't change. What you're seeing is, again, back to southbound traffic coming in and northbound traffic heading one way, eastbound on Pine. So as I just mentioned, we still had a lot of concerns about that alternative B in 2013. We gave a long list of feedback to the state. Once we had more design information, our mayor in March of 2013 sent 40 comments that our city council came together and said, hey, here's some current concerns we have about pedestrians and bicycles and lighting and stormwater and all the things that are so important then to our community that still are important to the community. And in April of 2013, the state responded to all 40 of those comments. Moving forward with various discussions after that on June 3rd of 2013, ultimately the city decided that we didn't want to implement this project. We had concerns about impacts to businesses. As the image showed before, we were going to be taking out Dubs, an icon in our community. The number of lanes gave us a lot of concern, pedestrian and bicycles, and how they crossed at intersections, the skewed angle of the intersection, all of those were unanimous concerns by City Council. And so the project took a pause for the next year and a half, 2 years almost. In 2015, the city and ITD signed a formal agreement, which we included in the staff report that was published in advance of this workshop. That's resolution 15-17. And it did a couple things, actually 5 overarching things. The first is that we agreed, while we didn't want the project at this time, that a future expansion would occur on that purchased railroad property when the system fails. And that failure is defined by ITD and their standards and their design manuals, as well as our agreement. So number 2 is that the city, we got our downtown streets back. So in 2015, this was the document that formally gave us First Avenue and Superior and Pine and Cedar. And then we also, in this agreement, ITD agreed to design and construct what we have today on Fifth Avenue, which is 2 lanes plus the turn pockets. And they also agreed to a level of service at intersections on their side of a D, as opposed to a level of service of D, which is typically acceptable to ITD. And we also agreed that it's okay if congestion occurs on our streets, because ultimately the US 2 functionality prevails. So in order to keep that level of service at D, the state adjusts the signals to make sure that it functions at a level of service of no less than a D. And our system has to, if you will, suffer the consequences of that. Preston, can we pause here for just a quick second and you maybe give a brief introduction about what a level of service is in ABCD?
Yeah, you bet. So I like to consider like a grade level in school. It's very similar where A is good. And you go down to level B, C, D, we do add an E in there and then an F. So E's and F's are considered pretty congested conditions where it's hard to move around. And those are the conditions that would be falling below that threshold of ITD, saying we want things at least a D or better. And in most cases, I'd like to see a C in more rural settings and smaller town settings, which is actually pretty typical around the nation as far as those thresholds go. But level service is a state of the practice metric used nationwide.
Thank you. This is just a snapshot of the agreement that's really trying on this slide to summarize what the agreement noted. Again, resolution 15-17, we agreed to the general design of the proposed reconfiguration of US 2 as shown in Exhibit B. I'll show the exhibit here on the next slide. Following the completion of the project, accept the jurisdiction and ownership of the streets that we have downtown. And number 5 there is that we acknowledge that that minimum performance level of a D during AM or PM peak per their manual. As well as this was the sentence I was referring to last, which is priority shall always be given to the mainline US 2 traffic and delay will not be adjusted on US 2 to improve mobility on the side streets if the minimum peak hour performance level of D is not being met on US 2 as outlined in a separate cooperative agreement. These are the exhibits that were included. So Exhibit A, on the bottom left there, you can see it notes, I'm sorry, it's black and white, previously acquired railroad right away for future expansion. So we agreed that in the future, if US 2 needs to be improved, that would be the location of the improvement. Again, the city signed off on that. And then Exhibit B is just reflecting what we have currently in place on Fifth Avenue, which is, if you will consider on the right-hand side, Exhibit B, think of that as our short or midterm, and on the left-hand side, really more that long-term. So responsible planning, we must plan for growth. That's why we have master plans, and our comprehensive plan is required by state law to plan appropriately for the future. And so we need to recognize what ifs as far as increases in volume of traffic and how as a community we want to handle that. So options, what are our options as the community grows and our region grows and we start to see an increase in vehicular traffic? We have 3. One is to move pass-through traffic out of town. That would be another byway, which has been considered by the city over the last 20 years. So whether that be on Great Northern or Syringa Heights or a variety of different locations, similar to what we did with the Highway 95 byway, let's just get the traffic out of town. So that's option 1. Option 2 is that we being the community, it could be widened. So, US 2 could be widened into a single alignment, similar to what we have on US 2 north of Cedar Street, which was the plan in the 90s, or we can split the directions of travel, similar to many other downtowns and what was shown in our 2012 Downtown Streets Plan and Guide that our community weighed in and said, this is why we favor of these 3 options, a couplet solution. I've tried to summarize them in partnership with Preston here on the bottom of the screen, A through E. Why would we, of those three options as a community, consider a couplet solution? Preston, do you mind going over A through E?
You bet. So in general, when you have fewer lanes, meaning instead of having lots of lanes, we'll use 5 in this instance, instead of having a 5-lane cross section like north of Cedar, and having it split into a couplet, you're then splitting them up into 2. So you have 2 on one road, 2 in the other road in opposite directions. And in this case, we're saying the turn lanes would be accommodated within those travel lanes and not having separate auxiliary lanes to do your turn movements. So you're essentially reducing a lane by 1, but also as far as a crossing standpoint, whether your vehicles crossing that street or pedestrians and bikes crossing that street, you're crossing less number of lanes than you would a larger cross section. And as a result, you're retaining character of the downtown environment, meaning you're maintaining a more vibrant, walkable community by having less lanes and less traffic, because now you're split your traffic in half as well. And because of those things I just mentioned, you have a safer pedestrian and bicycle crossing. Instead of crossing again 5 lanes in this example, we're crossing 2 lanes once, and then down the road crossing 2 lanes again. You're splitting your conflict points in half as well, which also relates to the safety aspect of it. When you're crossing a multi-lane road with bi-directional traffic, as a pedestrian, you have multiple points of conflict of either turning movements from the side street that you're crossing from, or the through movements in both directions, as well as the turning movements in the center turn lane. And crossing a one-way street, and in this instance, 2 lanes that we're talking in this example, you have those 2 conflict points, plus any turning movements in that one direction, depending on where your crosswalk is. So you're greatly reducing your conflict points. Conflict points equals propensity for conflicts or potential crashes. And those are what we want to reduce. For snow storage, those are obviously areas where you can put your snow in areas along the street that are designated for those, that, you think about on-street parking areas. In this case, we're not talking about on-street parking, but you think of that for storing your snow on the side of the roads or in landscaped areas, planter areas, that wouldn't be affecting your path for bikes and pedestrians, but instead in areas where they're not affecting travel. And then more wider sidewalks. Obviously, we have more right of way width because we don't have to accommodate as many lanes in that same area. So now we have more width to work with, to do, put in street furniture, put in landscaping, put in wider sidewalks, multi-use paths that can be bi-directional in some cases, depending on our right of way width. So those are the 5.
Thank you, Preston. So by way of an example, there are a number of communities throughout our country that have couplet solutions through their downtown core for all the reasons that Preston just articulated. This particular one is an example of a historic downtown area. I'm sure many in the room have been to Ashland, Oregon. It is known for many things, but particularly its 9-month-long Shakespeare Festival. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. It's a really vibrant area. The character in this location is phenomenal. The streets are typically loaded with pedestrians. Their Shakespeare Festival is actually immediately adjacent to this road that's imaged on the right-hand side. It's also a college town, so it really has a variety of different users between tourism as well as the university there. So on the left-hand side is depicting the couplet. On the upper left-hand side, Lithia Way and Main Street split into one-ways, 2 lanes of one-way traffic, and that is Oregon 99. So for those of you that don't know where Ashland is, I apologize. It's about 15 miles north of the California border on I-5. So then on the bottom right-hand side of that same Google image, the couplet comes back together at an intersection. On the right is a Google snapshot from East Main Street, looking to what is north. And you can see the parking arrangement that they have that's separated from the highway so that you don't have vehicles backing up onto the highway, but yet it's done in that landscaped character that Preston mentioned earlier, as well as the nice pedestrian crossings that they have, providing access and short crossing distances. It features the urban forest that is really essential in the Ashland area as well. They've done a great job to protect their trees and plant many more. Very much a place where pedestrians and bicyclists feel comfortable. You can see they even have the sharrows on their highway, which I think is really cool. And what I also thought was interesting is at this location where I took the photo, it has a walk score of 94. It's considered a walker's paradise on a couplet. And US 2 right now in Sandpoint has a walk score of 30. So we have a lot of opportunity to improve our community's goals to make our town a better walking environment. I think what's also really interesting about this image is that it doesn't split the community. So this couplet effectively goes through what is a very vibrant area of downtown Ashland, a community not that far off in our size. And again, it's a sense of place. It's not a divide at all within the community, quite the opposite.
Amanda, I'll add to that as well, that that street carries not quite double, but almost double what current US 2 does for us. And this is split, obviously. So this is about 9,000 to 10,000 cars a day on the one-way street, which in our projected, looking into 2040, we'll talk about this in a minute, but our projected 2040 volumes are about 20,000 on US 2. Split by half into a couplet, it's about 10,000 each, which equals almost the exact same as this, which is interesting.
Thank you, Preston. I think that's a great point. And I think, you know, in 2012 and looking at the couplet solution, I think that a lot of individuals in our community really recognize the value that a couplet can have to pedestrians and bicyclists, especially through a downtown area. Do you want to talk, Preston, a little bit more about these examples?
Sure, just a couple other examples, and obviously these aren't always, you know, one-to-one comparables to what we're talking about today, but just to give you an idea of what others look like, and these are all in downtown settings or just adjacent to downtown settings, and some of them are couplets, some of them are just one-way streets. We have two other small, medium-sized towns here: Golden, Colorado on the left-hand side with Jackson Street. It's a two-lane one-way facility, has a bike lane there, has a large sidewalk on the side with landscaping, and again in the same realm of about 10,000 daily traffic volumes. Corvallis on the other side, another one-way street, two lanes. There's some construction happening in that photo, but another way to traffic calm things as well is to create bulb outs, which is that landscape bulb out there with the crossing. They don't have the crosswalk painted yet in the middle of construction, but that's soon to come. But it creates shorter crossings for pedestrians and also gives a visual friction for motorists to slow down. The next one, a couple other examples are from Eugene, two different roadways and different ways of traffic calming as well. They used paint in the one image on the left-hand side on Oak Street to imitate bulb outs for visual purposes. They also use planters up on the top end of that photo with some candlestick barriers as well for the pedestrian crossing. In the other image, there's a cycle track, which is a protected bicycle path included into that roadway width. So there's lots of ways to look at things, but they all are kind of serving the same purpose, anywhere from 7,000 to 12,000 daily traffic volumes on these roads. And these are also, from a speed limit standpoint, ranging from 20 to 35 miles per hour. And then lastly, the last ones are from Madison, Wisconsin. Another one-way, two-lane street, especially like the one on the left-hand side. This is the same street in both images, just one's further down the road than the other. But you can see they have a multi-use path actually on both sides of the street. It's asphalt pavement on the right-hand side, a concrete pavement on the left-hand side. You see the pedestrians there in the one image. There's some sitting areas and a restaurant on the left-hand side as well. So these are, and Amanda mentioned this too, with Ashland. It's interesting that these are almost all, except for Golden, Colorado, college towns. which we didn't find these photos on purpose that way. It just turns out that way, which is interesting to me, not that Sandpoint's a college town, but the vibrancy that comes with college towns, a lot of people walking and biking, milling around, eating in establishments next to it is conducive to a nice environment, even with a one-way street.
Mr. Mayor, may I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Preston, interesting you highlight the college town. Am I not mistaken that Moscow, Idaho has a couplet on Highway 95, 2 lanes northbound, 2 lanes
Yeah,
southbound that are
actually.
attached by several blocks?
Yep.
So Moscow itself is split by a couplet. I hadn't thought of that before tonight.
Yep.
I did have a question for you about some of these examples, though. One of the comments from City Council back in 2013 to the ITD was the request that the design for Highway 2 through Sandpoint include lanes that are only 10 feet wide. ITD responded that lanes will be 12 feet wide to accommodate high percentage of trucks. I'm just wondering, from these examples, do you happen to know the lane widths for some of these? Do these reflect 10-foot wide lanes or 12-foot wide lanes? Because some of these look, quite quaint and small, but I wonder, are these examples that are realistic for what ITD has in mind through Sandpoint?
I don't know the measurements exactly. My guess is that they're ranging from 10 to 12 feet. That's a pretty standard width across the nation as far as widths go. And it's not uncommon for DOTs to require 12-foot lanes and sometimes 11-foot lanes. Most likely don't allow 10-foot lanes, is been my experience. But those are, that image on the screen right now, those are probably 11-foot lanes based on what I can see there. And I don't know. I don't know if ITD is going to let us waiver a little bit on some of those. Maybe when you get to the bulb out areas on the crossings, there may be some ability to constrict for those crossing purposes. But we do need to accommodate trucks as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, can I chime in there to help address the question, Jason?
Yep.
I just want to note that our downtown streets that have been revitalized on Cedar and First Avenue, those are all 12-foot lanes. We recently restriped Boyer Avenue to get it back to a standard of 12-foot lanes so that we could accommodate appropriate widths for bicyclists. So we actually have consistently used 12-foot lanes throughout our town, and it is the standard. So.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. Preston, I'm going to keep with you on this slide, please.
Okay, let's talk about highways. We kind of talked about the purposes of arterials in general, which oftentimes are highways, to the need for accommodate higher traffic volumes, sometimes higher speeds, and in this case, trucks. Since it is a state highway, there is a need to accommodate trucks and oftentimes large trucks. There is some pass-through travel on here that was part of the origin destination using the cell phone data, is to help understand what that pass-through is. And a good portion of pass-through was pushed to the byway when it was constructed, but there is still some pass-through on this, and it's not a large number. In fact, a majority of the trips that are happening in town are local trips, meaning trips that start and end within town without leaving anywhere else. And the next biggest portion are trips that are starting in town and then going out elsewhere, or starting out elsewhere and coming into town. And the smaller proportion of that is pass through on US 2 itself. And that, if you were to think about 11% of all trips in Sandpoint go through Fifth Avenue right now, US 2 portion of Fifth Avenue. And of that 11%, 16% of that is pass through right now today. So there is a component we need to accommodate there, but it's not a huge component. So that's important.
Preston, can I interrupt you there for a second? I'm sorry. I just wanted to note that cell phone data was collected in January or December and January, just so our city council and the public is aware that that's not considering our tourism season, where potentially pass-through traffic would be a higher rate.
I think it's actually January to December of the
January to December. Okay, perfect. Thank
year
you.
of 2019 data.
Okay. So the average of that period.
The average, yeah.
Yep.
So obviously by season, you could see some differences in pass by.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the jurisdiction here. Amanda's touched on this already. US 2 is a state facility. we as a city do not have jurisdiction over what we do with that. We can help influence as much as we can. And that's what we're hoping to do with this plan, is to help educate them on what our goals and objectives are as a city, and hopefully persuade them that, here's our goals. Can we help you in your next steps when you get to the point of evaluating and doing your own due diligence and evaluating these as your baseline before you get into design. Let's see what else we want to touch on here. We touched on that already. Okay, so the roundabout, let's talk about the roundabout at Boyer and US 2. So that was an alternative evaluated instead of the traffic signal. And I'm actually an advocate of roundabouts. I have several of those being constructed of my projects as we speak. And they definitely have their time and their place. And they have their time and their place, which means they don't always fit in every situation. And that can go for any intersection type, which is why we look at various alternatives when we look at intersections. With roundabout design and functionality, for roundabouts to work in their most efficient manner, you need to have balanced volumes on all your approaches. And the reason you want balanced volumes, meaning, just for an example, we would want something like 800 on the northbound, we want 800 in the eastbound or westbound, 800 southbound, 800 eastbound. Obviously, you can give or take 100 or so within those to get your more or less equal balanced volumes. In this case, we're not even close to that. We have 1,000 going northbound, we have 800 going southbound, we have 150 going westbound, and almost 500 going eastbound. So you can see the imbalance around that. And because of that, the roundabout actually ends up in failing conditions below a level service D, which is unfortunate because there are some benefits with those. They do have a tendency to slow traffic down, and they have a tendency to reduce the severity of crashes, not necessarily reduce the number of crashes, but reduce the severity of crashes. And if they're designed correctly, they can accommodate trucks. But in this case, it is not a good application given what we saw. And you do have some queues that spill back into adjacent intersections as a result of that. And that's looking at a single lane roundabout.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
Preston, when we talked this afternoon, I looked into the roundabout solution. And when I called ITD, they said they do not put roundabouts on state highway systems. And so I read an article actually from October 2022 in Ketchum Haley. And the ITD was going to go along with because they wanted a roundabout on the state highway to move traffic through. And ITD said, came back and said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to set a precedent. And so I think that, and they said because of volumes, and so they didn't want it on any of the state highway systems. And I know you and I talked about that a bit, and you couldn't think of any of them that had, I like roundabouts as well. So I was quite interested in the fact that they said no. So I'm not sure if they'll change their mind or if that's even an option, but just some information I found out.
That's interesting. It's tough to say if they'll change their mind or not. There are other DOTs that were on their same page as far as don't want roundabouts anywhere, that have since changed their minds in other states. So it may be coming down the road. But for now, they're scared of setting a precedent, and sometimes that's
Mr.
unfortunate.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, a roundabout based on the data and the analysis, I think you're going to show us some examples of the type of analysis you do with computer simulations, show a roundabout solution as failing immediately at that intersection. So despite the visual appeal, the kind of modern progressive appeal of roundabouts, and they seem to work pretty well in other parts of town, at that intersection, we'd immediately have a level of service that's below the current level of service. So ITD wouldn't support it, whether or not they support roundabouts, because it's a failing solution.
Right.
And you could say, well, what about a 2-lane roundabout? I think as a pedestrian, a cyclist, that would be possibly the worst possible outcome for that intersection. 2-lane roundabouts are not appealing to anybody.
They are harder to navigate, especially for those who aren't used to going through them. And we try to stay away from those as much as we can and try to make a 1-lane work as much as possible. They can work, and they do work places, but for pedestrians and cyclists, they're not super comfortable, to your point.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
And during my conversation with Preston this afternoon, I asked him some out of the box questions and said, you know, if we weren't necessarily designing for the state highway and we were designing just for the residents of Sandpoint, how would he look at this differently? And he said that there were many napkin sketches that happened, and he went so far as to dig back into his files and find something that was not under the proper heading, and showed me some of the napkin sketches. And he quite lovingly referred to it as the blob about, because it wasn't truly a roundabout. So he was going out of his way to figure out how that potentially could work, but could not find a solution to make the cars go through without failing. I then discussed with him my experiences with some roundabouts that aren't full, complete 2-lane roundabouts, but in certain sections have prioritized turning out lane or turning in lane for different directions of traffic. And we discussed that at length, and those things would also fail or become much less safe for bicyclists and pedestrians. So I just wanted to share that with the public, that we as your council members are up here trying to figure out solutions. I went home after my 2:15 meeting that ended at 3 o'clock and got on the internet and started searching other options about, well, how can we think out of the box? Preston's one human being, but maybe there's another human being on the planet. And I was unable to come up with solutions. So we continue to work hard.
That's a good comment. I'll just add on to that. That brings up a thought I had in Park City, Utah, which is another resort oriented recreation town that sees snow, and there's another state highway that feeds into one of their big ski resorts in town called Deer Valley. And they call it the Marsack Roundabout. It was a roundabout done 20 years ago or so. That we actually worked on back then. And with the amount of traffic coming through that, and again, unbalanced approach of that roundabout, it quickly got to a failing standpoint to where they had to put in a bypass lane. So there's a whole separate lane. So now they have 2 lanes going through the roundabout, but one is separated by a curb to go, and it's free flow through. Well, the other traffic is going through and being metered by the roundabout just to get it to work. And there's 0 pedestrians in there. There's 0 bicycles in there. They took them completely off the system because it's just not safe and conducive to that sort of use. Any other questions? We probably move on to the next slide.
I can take this one if you want a breathing break, Preston. I think this slide speaks for itself, that planning doesn't necessarily equal faster implementation of construction. So specific to US2, many more factors are required to move forward before any actual construction would take place. We need, as jurisdictions, data to support what we do moving forward as far as a need. And then the project has to be included in an adopted budget. Everyone is familiar with the city's annual budget. From a state's perspective, it's an 8-year forecast called the ITIP, which is their transportation investment plan. It needs an engineered design. Previous presentations at city council, we mentioned, 3 years is the fastest. That is really rare. It typically takes approximately 3 years to do a design overall. And then we obviously have right-of-way acquisition, and then bidding a project within the budget that was assigned and awarding a contract ultimately. So those steps, we as the city even implement them on projects like Great Northern. So every one of those steps has to be, the box has to be checked before we move forward with construction. So just because there's a concept doesn't necessarily mean that it's faster implemented. But what shovel-ready designs do, so going from concept to an actual design, is that checking the box of design enables our community to have certainty and understanding that someday when there is enough data to support a need, we all know what that looks like. And it's not a concept that's going to continue to evolve and evolve and evolve over time, that it's actually a design. So adjacent property owners in the community understand what that crossing looks like and where are the trees and what type of lighting is going to be provided. And it's all been modeled and we all agree upon it. So many more steps of engagement and levels of detail that go into the process of getting to actual construction. This one's for you, Preston.
All right, let's talk about ADT. That's actually, we misspoke there. It's not annual daily traffic, it's average daily traffic. There is another term called AADT, which is annual average daily traffic, which is just a slightly different term. So we look at ADT for a couple of reasons. One, it just informs us from a high level how we should size our streets at a very high planning level side of things. And that's about all we use it for. We then dig into the peak hour side of things. And there are typically 2 peak hours in your day. You have a morning peak and you have an afternoon peak. And in this case, we looked at the worst peak of those 2 peaks for the planning of the MTM peak. And that was the PM, the afternoon peak. So all of our traffic analysis was done based on that worst peak hour of the day, but also based on kind of your average day of the year, your May conditions when school's still in session, but not like your peak days that would happen in a summer day in July or August. So ITD collects ADT data on a regular basis. They have continuous count stations at periodic locations on their systems throughout the state that is continuously counting traffic. And then where they don't have a continuous count stations, they go out there and put down tube counts on an occasional basis every few years to get a spot count and then kind of estimate that throughout the years as it goes along before they count another one. And then the city also collects their own data as well at various locations, both from a ADT standpoint on some roadways, as well as collecting some intersection counts. And when we talk about intersection counts, those are turning movement counts. So we're collecting how traffic is moving, each movement through that intersection, including pedestrians and bikes. Let's see, we talked about how it's not representative of a busy season in summer. Winter is pretty considerably lower than summer when you're looking at those two, but it is, you do have some peaks in there during some of that winter time. But May and September tend to be on the higher end of average, but still in that average and not quite your peak like you see in the summer. And that's what most of the planning is based upon. Kind of the moniker of you don't want to build a church for Easter Sunday as the example. We don't want to build our roadways for that peak condition. Those peak conditions that are happening because of events, that's where management comes into play. You need to have event management plans for those. You don't build your streets for those peak summer days. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just look at the historical data here. This is on US2, right around the downtown area. So in 2010, the ADT, average daily traffic, was just over 20,000. I think it's 20,200. And that was, if you remember, that was still kind of in the middle of the Great Recession. Things hadn't picked back up yet. This was a phenomenon nationwide. Traffic volumes dropped, decreased, gas prices were way up, and so forth. So you saw some decreases in travel, and that's why you saw that initial decrease. And then the bypass was constructed in 2012. That opened up, and you see a drastic decrease in traffic volumes at that point. From there on, you see a gradual increase kind of start to climb back up, climb back up, climb back up. And if you were to look at that over the years, it's about an average of about 2.5% per year average is what you're looking at there. And you see that drop in 2020 from the pandemic as people were kind of in lockdown mode and then starting to pick back up. So as of today, or in 2022, in this instance, we're at 13,500. The next slide starts to look at forecasting. So as we forecast out to the year that we were estimating in our kind of build out phase or a long-term phase in the master plan was the year 2040. So if you were to use the trends that have been happening historically and continue those forward, and actually the more recent trends are even higher than that 2.5 number I was mentioning. Right now, the average is about 2.3% per year traffic growth, which is slightly lower than the population percent increase that I mentioned earlier, but it's trending right along that same line, but just not quite a 1-to-1 ratio. So if that trend continues, we're going to be right back where we were in 2010. We'll be at the same point in 2040, pre-bypass. Obviously, lots of things can change and occur there, and population. I know there's projections for population to double between now and 2040, 2050. And that's happening across the West as well, as people are kind of flooding out of different states and going to more rural type areas and working remotely and all sorts of things that are happening and occurring with that. And there are things that came out of the Trend Lab Plus workshop that we talked about earlier that helped decrease some of that projection as well. Teenagers are not getting the licenses at 16 as often as they were when we were all growing up. And so those are all kind of things. Gas prices are fluctuating. There's all sorts of things that go into this. The retirement population, all those things factor into how people are going to travel into the future. But just based on historical trends on what we're seeing right now, this is actual data. This isn't even forecasting data. This is actual data from the last 5-10 years. Continuing on that trend, we're going to be at over 20,000 on US2 by 2040.
Mayor?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, so there's no confusion, that red line, one could see that and see there's not going to be any ebbs and flows through the years.
Yeah.
That's just an idea, right, to get to the 20,000, not that it's going to be perfectly,
Forecasted number. There's going to be oscillations in there.
just in case there's any confusion for the
Similar to
public.
what you're seeing on the previous 10 years there, where you see some spikes going up, spikes going down for
Right.
whatever reasons. In this case, we had a pandemic in the middle of that, and in 2016 or 2017 or so, I'm not sure what happened there, but you'll see oscillations, no doubt, within that.
Just want to make sure
20
so
years.
some people don't get confused.
Yep.
And Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
question. That this rate of growth of 2.5%, does that also assume that the composition of the traffic using Highway 2 will be the same as with regards to what percentage are within town to within town to Bonner County to within town, which I think you said earlier is the majority of traffic. The vast majority of traffic on Highway 2 is local traffic, basically. I would just point out something for the council to consider and for our planning teams to consider is, you know, when we talk about multimodal transportation, if we successfully implement an effective multimodal transportation plan, it seems possible that we can change the modes of transportation that people choose in the future so that people choose to use their vehicles perhaps less for local trips. So when we talk about priority pedestrian network, bicycle network, a highly effective multimodal transportation plan should result in people opting for alternative modes of transportation. So I would hope that one of our planning goals would be to reduce the percentage of trips taken by vehicles in Sandpoint so that we can flatten the curve here and perhaps, you know, reduce the demand for vehicle travel within Sandpoint.
Yeah.
That to me is like hopeful planning for true multimodal transportation. We assume people are always going to drive at the rate they do now. I think if that's an assumption we're making, it means we're failing with regards to our pedestrian and cyclist networks.
And that is called for in multiple places in the comp plan.
Exactly. That's a key element of our comp plan. So truly, like if we're really planning based on our comp plan and our own vision for the future, I would hope that this number would never come to pass.
Those are great thoughts. And I'll just add a couple of things to that. Because the Sandpoint's not alone in experiencing this and wanting to find other solutions to mitigating their future growth. That's bound to happen unless we stop people from moving here and having babies and those sort of things. The population is going to continue to grow. And if we continue to develop and house them and have places for them to work, that trend will continue to grow. Right now, based on our planning, this is assuming the status quo. What is happening now with that growth rate applied to that? There are transportation demand management strategies that then can come into play to help incentivize and educate folks to make different choices in how they travel, to not travel by themselves in their vehicles, to have high occupancy vehicles, to choose to telecommute, work from home, or at least shift their work schedule so they're not traveling during the peak times from a sustainability standpoint. To walk or to bike, to have car shares, to have micromobility, have scooter options and e-bike shares. I mean, we can go down the list of lots of things, walking school buses, which was actually mentioned as part of the division, road safety audit. So there's lots of things to do here, and there's lots of communities as examples here. I will say it's a tough road to incentivize people to take this. And oftentimes it takes monetary incentive to help them do this. Otherwise they don't. And you can look at Stanford University. We do a lot of work with Stanford. they get fined by the city of Palo Alto if they don't maintain a certain level of traffic going in and out of their campus. And so it's a kind of draconian side of things. That's what they've been limited to. So every year they have to revamp their TDM, their transportation management strategies, to limit that number. I think it's around 40,000 trips in and out of their campus. Giving free transit passes to their staff and their employees and to the students, and incentivizing by different educational programs, helping, not allowing parking for certain classes and grades. So there's lots of things you can do. And I'll use one other example, Aspen, Colorado. Another one of our clients, they took a stance in 1996 to say, this traffic level that we see right now, we don't want any worse than this. This is where we want to be, max level. And so that was written. And in order to maintain that, because obviously they haven't stayed stagnant, they've continued to redevelop and populations increased. They have to maintain what that average daily traffic is going across their bridge into town, and they look at it on a weekly basis and actually get alerts when they get near that number or go over that number, and then they kind of kick in some other TDM strategies to get below that. That is a constant struggle for them, and it's a great goal, and they have a lot of great things happening in town as a result of it, but it does. It costs a lot of money for one, and it takes a lot to educate the community and to help change their behaviors to get them to that point. And they're having to revamp it every single year, because once maybe they put in an e-bike share system that helps reduce that and keeps them down below that. But by next year, people have changed to maybe a little bit, or new people moved in, or whatever the situation is. And that travel has changed and swung back the other way, and now they're exceeding again. So now I have to go back, revisit things. What do we need to change this year? And it's not necessarily capital improvements. A lot of times they're program improvements or stipulations they put on developments. So there's things down the road here we can think of as a city to start to put into place on the TDM side of it.
Sure. And just with the full awareness that the ITD corridor itself is not the city's jurisdiction, from a comp plan perspective, from a city vision and planning perspective, if we want to avoid having a 4 or 5 lane highway through this town, perhaps we should start thinking about changing our behaviors, because 80% of the traffic on that highway, which ITD is measuring and basing their future planning decisions on, is our traffic. It's us driving. I'm guilty. I drove here tonight and I live half a mile away. I see my friend rode his bike tonight. I should have done the same. But that's just something for everybody to consider, right? I mean, it's our use of this corridor that will ultimately result in the ITDs coming here and doing what they need to do to accommodate our use. If we don't want to see that widening, if we want to see something at a smaller scale, it's going to require our community to make changes and to, perhaps vision. And we're all, Councilwoman Rule brought up the term induced demand at our February meeting. If we build for 20,000 vehicles today, we're going to have 20,000 vehicles in 15 years. If we plan for a smaller capacity and then come up with alternative and incentivize, I'm not talking about congestion charges or taxing people who drive in our city streets, but if we do prioritize those pedestrian cyclist networks, I'm hopeful that perhaps we don't need to design for a 20,000 ADT future.
Yeah, good comments. I want to add a couple of things onto that. I'm glad you picked out that a majority of the traffic that's happening in town is us. It's not so much the pass by. So it's important to understand that, because the issues that are happening in town are because of all of us here. So there is a great opportunity to change things in the future. Right now, if we don't change things, that's where we're going to be.
Exactly.
And the other important thing to understand is that building roads doesn't create traffic. Land use generates traffic. So by building roads doesn't mean that cars are just going to show up. Land use is what generates the traffic. It's the people who are using that land use that are generating the traffic. If there was nothing here, there would be no cars on that road. So we need to understand that too. It's not just because we build it doesn't mean that they will come. If we build it, yes, people are going to come because the population is increasing. So that's where we need to start looking at the educational side of it on the TDM and changing travel behaviors and how we travel in town.
Ready for me to advance the slide?
Yeah.
I think Preston, this is just recapping what you stated, and maybe giving some examples of what's failing in town by the metric of a level of service. You want to maybe speak to Bridge and First, and then the east side of Church at Fifth.
Yeah, and Bridge and First is one of those intersections that we did look at some peak season conditions and on a Saturday condition because of the nature of that intersection and the people it's serving. Everyone's aware of that situation during peak times. It gets very congested with very long queues backing up across the bridge and into downtown. And so the plan focused on some alternatives there to help mitigate that situation, both in a short-term and a long-term condition. Church and Fifth is where the traffic signal is today. And I think everyone's probably experienced that as well. You'll see on a regular basis, especially in the evenings, that queue is backing up for quite a ways over several blocks into downtown. So those are intersections that are currently failing. And there are likely other intersections that are failing in certain movements. But when you think about, I should probably clarify that level of service is looked at slightly differently at a signalized intersection or a roundabout. Those two are the same in that they look at the average delay of everyone using that roundabout from all sides of it, or all sides of the signal averaged together. When you're looking at a stop sign, stop controlled intersection, the level of service is based on the worst movement of that intersection, which typically is that left turn at that stop sign. They tend to be the worst because they have to wait for gaps in both sides of traffic to make their movement. So just a clarification on that. We can probably move on, Amanda.
Okay. So I think this slide, really the intent of it is to recapture our simulations and introduce the idea of running different models. So the do nothing other than move the signal from Church to Pine, the option of keeping everything a single lane of travel on US 2, and then 2 lanes of travel in each direction on US 2. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that Preston can show you the simulations.
Okay. All right, I'm going to show you a couple, or I guess 3 videos here. And a couple things to note here as I get this queued up. So this is just a snapshot in time. We run our analysis for a full hour of that peak hour, in this case, the PM peak hour, looking at kind of your average day of the year, a May-ish time frame. And this is not necessarily your peak of your peak, but it's a generalized peak in your so we're just looking at a minute snapshot in time. So understand that there are times where things may be worse. There could be times where things are even better than this. But just know this is just a snapshot within a peak hour, just so you can understand how traffic is moving around.
And this is present day infrastructure?
Oh, yes, thank you. This is partially present day infrastructure with a couple improvements. Those improvements being the short-term improvements that were stated in the MTMP, that being the signal at Church moved down to Pine, and then Pine being changed or converted to a 2-way traffic. So those are the changes you'll see here, plus the new signal at Ella Avenue crossing US.
And the numbers that you're running here are the 20,400 that we saw projected.
Yes, the year 2040, those are these, so that's the projected volume. So everything else is the same, meaning US 2 is maintaining a 2-lane facility with turn lanes where they're needed at the intersections. The red line is your multi-use path, the community path on the side of the road. You can't see them, but there are pedestrians and bicycles traveling on that red path. Crossing over Ella Avenue here. Start to see some queues building up here as you get to Boyer. And I'm gonna pause this real quick. So you can see this is existing, or not existing, but this is the existing infrastructure on Pine, meaning today Pine has to come over here to Boyer to then turn to get onto US two. This queue of Pine goes on for quite a ways, and it will continue to do that and be worse. This, as everyone knows, this is kind of a mess of situation between Boyer and Pine, and then the one-way portion of Pine. You also see queues starting to build up on US two heading towards Fifth Avenue. So we do have, so this is kind of a do nothing other than those short-term improvements we talked about. We'll move over here to the signal at Pine, and in general, you'll see this is starting to clear out a little bit with this simulation, but this queue will back up for quite a ways up into here. You can see it building up in here, up into Cedar. So if we do nothing, you will start to have queues spilling back into our signals and into Church Street and even going forward. Okay, let's look at another one here. Let's look at this will kind of take us along the same path visually, what we just did. Everything here stays the same infrastructure wise, but we do have that couplet modeled here as we get up to the northeast here. This is the realigned Boyer. So with the south leg there with a left turn into Boyer.
Can you pause there really quick?
Yep. Let me go back just a little bit.
Can you just highlight where the Dubs property is?
Okay, so this is the Dubs property. What this model isn't showing, and it should be, is with the Dubs property now in our area to be able to use, this Boyer would then tie in a T formation here. And the reason for that is, one, we tee up to an intersection. We always want to tee to a 90 degrees perpendicular to a roadway whenever possible. You get into skews and you start to get into issues of longer pedestrian crossings, longer bicycle crossings, and poor sight distance. Having to look over your shoulder in a way that isn't conducive to seeing things real well, and a higher propensity of crashes happening because of that. So keeping things at a 90 degrees as much as possible. So that's what the Dubs property helps us do, is create a safer condition, but also it gives us a longer length between where this left turn would be to come in here on Boyer to where this left turn that goes into on Pine with this new realigned intersection is. So we don't have what currently is showing here, this overlapped condition where it's kind of wide. It won't need to be that wide at that point because we're shifting everything down. We can have a longer queue length for this left turn going into Boyer, and also have a longer queue length or storage length for the left turns going on to Pine here.
So just to be clear, this is what's currently in our adopted multimodal plan. With one exception, our current plan shows 4 lanes, 2 in each direction west of Boyer. This simulation is showing 1 lane with a turn lane at intersections.
Yes,
Correct.
So graphically, the plan does show multiple lanes. It was never intended or even written in the MTMP that there were multiple lanes on these roadways. Understanding that ITD is gonna have to go through their due diligence, through their design work to understand what that is. Now we're keeping things fairly big picture here in that term. And right now it looks like 2 lanes, 3 lanes at the intersections should work okay going southwest down on US 2. The one change also that's not in the MTMP, which is the change that was suggested in the February meeting, is this left turn into Boyer. In the MTMP, there is a connection to Boyer here, but it was a right in, right out only. So with Dubs happening here and us being able to push this intersection further away from the Pine intersection, we're able to get that left turn in here and have it work efficiently. So that's another change.
So the advantage of Dubs, which was the original proposed amendment 6 weeks ago, was to realign Boyer through the Dubs property, is to assure safe left turn from westbound Highway 2 onto South Boyer. Whereas in this concept, that is not a safe distance between the signaled intersection and the left turn on Boyer.
I would say it's a safe distance, but it's not a distance that is, well, to use your words, I'm going to say safe, but I'm not saying safe in terms of crash purposes, but we don't want queues going back into that signal.
Gotcha.
And the further away we can get from that signal and not have queues back up into that signal, the better off we are. And being able to have a smaller cross section in this area where this left turn right here isn't overlapping with this left turn right here, they can have their own little area and be nice and tight in that. So that's there. This model also doesn't show sidewalks other than this multi-use path, but there are sidewalks proposed for this south side of US 2 that parallels here where there aren't any today. So crossing wise, and I should mention this portion of Boyers would be gone in this instance. What we do with this area of green space, leave it green space, whatever you end up doing with that is available. This portion of Boyer does remain. It's not showing in this model, but this portion of Boyer is there.
And, you know, visually too, like the way that this appears is like it's, you know, multiple roads essentially, but that's for visual purposes to be able to identify the flow of traffic. But this is essentially a standard 2-lane road like we have there today.
That's right.
Okay.
So now we start to get into the couplet area, and you'll notice here, I'll pause here for a second as well. With a 1-lane couplet, so we have 1 lane southbound here, and you'll see in a minute, this is 1 way northbound over here. Which generally will probably get us by for a little while. What that little while is, I don't know exactly, but for now, we know that in the long term, meaning 20 years down the road, when we start to see those 20,000 sort of numbers, and again, it's not about the 20,000 specifically, it's about how that 20,000 interacts with the intersections themselves, because that's what drives the capacity of roadways in your town is intersections, not roadway segments. It is showing that 2 lanes is likely going to be needed into the future, but we can probably get by with 1 lane for the time being. So what that year is hard to know. And if it were me planning this and needing to understand what right of way we need, I'm going to say, let's plan for the wider right of way. We don't need to build all those lanes at the moment, but have that banked so that we can build it when we need it. And we'll look at that here in a minute. I kind of jumped the gun on that, but I wanted to explain the 1-way situation here, because you'll see these queues for 1-way. These are backing up, and at times it backs up more than a 1/4 mile, which means it's going up into Cedar Street. And as a result of that, I'll pause this again. Because of the 1-way, because of the 1 lane, we have limited gaps, meaning less gaps for other side streets to make their movements to get into that flow of traffic. So because we had less gaps in this, because we're only in 1 lane, that's carrying a fair amount of traffic during a peak hour. Your Church Street, even though a good portion of your Church Street traffic already shifted down to Pine, because Pine is now 2-way, there's still some traffic on Church coming from downtown that still wants to utilize the street system. But because there aren't many gaps in your travel going southbound, you start to see a queue build up here as well. That does queue up back past and go into town a little bit here. So there are some, and again, this is a 2040 condition, so you can see what some of those issues are. If we don't get into a 2-lane system in 2040, you'll start to see these conditions where you still have queues backing up from Pine all the way up to Cedar, and on Church Street backing up into town. That's going to be a given. And if we can maintain that delay on city streets, will ITD be okay with that? Probably, if we're not affecting them. Where it is going to affect them is right here where we have Church Street that is backing up past one of their facilities, in this case, the northbound section of the couplet, that could be affecting operations here if you have northbound traffic wanting to turn left here and not being able to, and then you have queues starting to back up here. So those are potentials to just keep in mind.
Could you occasionally point to a building that we can recognize? Thank you, sorry.
Sure. Local will have to direct me on what the name of these buildings are. But this
So
is-
Army surplus is right at the top of, right there where your pointer is Army surplus.
And then Matchwood on the left.
Matchwood on the left. Yep, Matchwood there.
This is Oak Street here. So with Oak Street, the proposal in the MTMP was to close this portion of Oak Street in between the couplet and make this an active transportation use only, meaning pedestrians and bikes only. So this is a great little area that you could be creative with how you create a nice, vibrant location for some active transportation use, and how you utilize this triangle space, you know, kind of the world's your oyster as far as that goes. You know, you could see, well, I'm just, in my mind, I think, oh, let's put some food trucks there, let's activate the space, have these great users there that can walk and bike through here and have some food and things as they make their way down into downtown or back and forth.
Preston, whose property is that triangle there at the north end of the couplet? Is that ITD's or is that the city's?
ITD.
It's ITD.
So would ITD allow us to develop that in some way if it's not being used for lanes of traffic? I don't assume you know the answer to
not
that.
sure.
Maybe that's a Jennifer question.
That's negotiable.
Yeah, is that
Well-
something we can negotiate?
You can do exchanges between governmental entities without having to put a price to it, without having to go to market to it.
But there's a possibility of there being some like pedestrian space in this unused ITD corridor, because it's not going to be a parking lot any longer, obviously. I'm not asking you to commit to that. I'm just saying from a negotiation standpoint, this could be something that we benefit from in the future. If the ITD does not have other uses for that.
Correct. And I
Space.
would say similar example would be with downtown when they quit claim deeded the streets back to the city.
Yeah.
So
The other thing I'll note here is because we are crossing a roadway here, and it's a fairly close distance between these two intersections, which is why we're not allowing vehicles through here. So vehicles only have a right in, right out on Oak Street at this location. We have a crossing that could look any number of different ways, depending on what the demand ends up being as a result of this being close to vehicles. And as population increases and things, and as demand increases for active transportation users, there will be a need to do something more than just painted crosswalks, most likely. And that could be anywhere from just enhanced crossing, from highly visible painting to flashing beacons, to rectangular rapid flashing beacons, to pedestrian hybrid beacons, to pedestrian signals. Lots of different things you could do. I'm just thinking outside the box here as well. Given the short distance, there's not enough time, obviously, for pedestrians to go from cross Oak here and then make it all the way across over here on the same signal time or crossing time, because it's a little bit too far for that walking speed. But for bikes who are traveling at a higher speed, there could be some coordination between them. If it were some sort of signal or beacons sort of situation, you could have those coordinated. So if it's actuated by a bicycle, it could give you a walk time or ride time in this case, all the way across all in one fell swoop. So there's lots of opportunity here that you could look into for that crossing. And that would tie in obviously to your east and west, or sorry, your north and south multi-use path here. You can see pedestrians there walking along, having a good time. And use,
So, Preston,
Yeah.
maybe you can confirm too, because I think there is some misunderstanding that with creating the couplet right now on Fifth Avenue, we are essentially 5 lanes. We have 2 lanes either direction with then a turning lane in the middle. What is envisioned in our concept and with the couplet, it's not retain 5 lanes and adding more lanes, it would reduce the number of lanes on Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, so with the current concept on the screen right now, and just to reiterate, this concept specifically as far as number of lanes was not in the MTMP. It's explicitly spelled out saying this is the couplet's going to be 1 lane each direction, nor was it explicitly spelled out saying it would be 2 lanes each direction. Knowing that there's going to have to be some coordination with ITD on that. But to Jennifer's point, US 2 Fifth Ave up here is a 5-lane cross section. Why I'm having this lag. So you have 2 lanes in the southbound, 2 lanes in the northbound, and a center turn lane. And it becomes just a left turn lane as you get to the intersections. So that cross section is not intended to continue down through the couplet. That would then split, meaning you'd either have 1 lane split here and 1 lane split here and gain a turn lane if you need it at the intersections. Or in the 2-lane concept, it would be 2 lanes southbound here and 2 lanes northbound here. So you would never have a 5-lane cross section. Right now up there, that cross section up at just north of Cedar, this is an 84, 85 foot crossing for a pedestrian to make at the signal. That is massive. And I know because I cross those all the time in my own hometown that they're not comfortable to cross. Crossing a single lane or crossing even 2 lanes with 1 direction of travel is going to be much more comfortable to cross, where you are only having to look in 1 direction to cross. You have limited your conflict points, things we've already talked about here. So those are important thing to point out. Thanks, Jennifer. Any questions on that before I change over to the 2-lane concept?
No.
Do you have an estimate of what the level of service would be at these intersections with the 1-lane concept?
Yeah, so the 1-lane concept. The 1-lane concept goes to your church, street, and US 2 couplet areas will be at an F in that condition because of those queues happening in that westbound condition. So that's what's driving your poor level of service there is your side streets, which generally speaking wouldn't be a big issue if it was over on the city side, but since that middle section is and crossing over to your the northbound couplets portion of it, that does become a little bit of an issue because it does start to block traffic in that condition. Pine Street and the Pine Street signal and US 2, that is a level service below a level service C, so C or better.
Also, Cedar was really backed up east of 5th.
Yeah, Cedar, I don't have those conditions exactly, but coming out of town, that movement in particular, you'll start to see some big queues there, and those are things that are happening today. It'll just be exacerbated into the future. And what will likely happen is people will start to utilize other alternatives, which is a great part of the grid system is utilize the downtown network that we have, the avenues, and start to filter down to other roadways, to Pine, for instance, that has quite a bit of capacity now by changing it to 2-way. The Boyer intersection, Boyer and US 2 is at a level service C in that condition in both the 2-lane and the 1-lane condition.
Which is acceptable to ITD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's teetering on that point of a C or a D, depending on, it's kind of, because things are based on a delay, seconds per vehicle. And their threshold from a C to a D is 35 seconds. So you could be at like 34 seconds, which is a C, but you could be 2 seconds more and then be a D over that point. So we're right around that area, which right now is functioning.
And to reiterate, they agreed to a level D on their system in the 2015 agreement.
Mhm.
So you'll see a lot of the same here, same fly through. Don't see much difference here, same cross sections as well. You'll see the same cross section at Boyer. And what you start to see is a lack of queues. So you'll remember at this point in the one lane version, this queue right here was backing up past Church. And Church had that standing queue here going past over the northbound section. Because you introduce 2 lanes through here, we now can accommodate twice as many vehicles through that section. And it's not even about the throughput. It's not about how many vehicles we can get through. It's about how many we can store. So by doubling your lanes, you double the amount of storage you have for your vehicles. So that's really it's really not changing much in the level of service at Boyer, but it's changing a lot in level service to the north, especially at Church.
Right, for the 5th and 6th, backing up.
Mayor,
It doesn't seem.
you want me to answer that? Sure. Let me back up here a little bit. Okay, so you're asking about,
The proposed light at Pine and Fifth.
oh yeah. Oops, jumped too far. This is being jumpy. So this is what you see here is the proposed condition. So this is a 3-legged signalized intersection. So we don't add another leg to this. This stays the way it is in its current 3-legged condition. But now we just add the signal there and add 2-way traffic here. So instead of just being 1-way eastbound, we now introduce westbound back into the signal.
Where is the signal? Could you just go and clarify?
This whole intersection is signalized. So you
Stop there, west on Pine.
right
where
here.
they did Fifth.
These colored bars are basically the stop bars of your intersection. So cars come up. Right now, the model is showing that that's a red light. So cars are coming up and stopping at the red light at the stop bar. And right now, in this phase of the signal, it's a green light. So that stop bar is green. So all the eastbound traffic is currently moving because they have the green light.
So you're showing 3 lanes on Pine there, both sides.
This is a turn lane. It's
Oh, I
actually
see.
1 lane
got it.
each direction, but you have a right turn lane and a through movement.
Thank you.
It goes back for a short period.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could Councilor Rule please maybe lean in or adjust the mic? We can't hear online the questions.
Amanda,
wasn't her.
it's not one of the counselors that's asking a question.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. When Preston's answering questions and online, we don't know what the question is. So if we could just a note, thanks.
Yeah, and I just remind the public that we're having questions from the council at this moment, and after this next phase of the presentation, we'll open up to questions that we've received from the public.
Okay, this is a good snapshot of a pedestrian crossing, or in this case, they're bikes that are crossing at the moment. So bikes are crossing, which means we are stopping traffic in whatever fashion that ends up being. In this case, you see that as a result of that stop, of being able to stop because of the bikes, traffic is starting to queue up. And because of the 2 lanes, we're able to accommodate that queue within the existing right of way of our 2-lane facility. If this were back to the 1-lane facility and we saw this condition, this would be backing up into Cedar. So I just want to make sure everyone is very clear that while you don't see major differences in level of service at intersections, you do see some unintended consequences of the 1 lane with queuing spilling back into other intersections with that 1 lane. So just be aware, I guess, is my biggest point there.
So why is there? So with the 2 lane, there's now a proposed signal at Church? Or I'm sorry, that's Oak.
This is Oak, yep. And this is just a
Train crossing.
pedestrian or bike
Got it.
crossing.
Got it.
Yep. Okay. We can probably jump back now to presentation. Amanda, I'm going to throw it back to you for sharing.
And that's full screen for you guys.
Yep.
Okay, great. The bottom note there in the yellow box, thank you very much, Preston, for you and I know your entire team that helped put those simulations together to help enhance the understanding. Maybe you could just reiterate, I guess, the time of year and that we're not looking necessarily at worst case, and kind of to that point that we intentionally underplan to ensure that we're not overbuilding. Could you kind of speak to the time of year those volumes were applied for the simulation?
Yes, so 2040 conditions, so 17 years down the road. So applying that growth rate per year to our existing traffic volumes to get to that 2040 condition. And that is based on May conditions, traffic volumes wise, so not your peak of the peak in summer day, but kind of your peak of typical days in your, it's not even off peak, but your kind of typical school peaks in your May timeframe.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, this is your slide too, Preston.
Okay. All right, so what we talk about congestion, there's good things and there are bad things about congestion. Some of the positives are, well, we reduce speeds because people have a hard time moving the way they want to and maneuvering the way they want to. And as a result of slow moving vehicles, you do have a reduction in severity of incidents or crashes that could occur. As a result of those reduced speeds, you do have gaps that can occur or lengthen as a result of slower moving vehicles, whereas faster moving vehicles, cover that gap quicker, and it's harder for side streets to make those movements and pedestrians, bicycles to make their movements without understanding or gauging that speed with less congestion. But again, we're not talking about high speeds on these roadways. We're talking about 35 miles per hour speeds on these roadways or less, depending on how we end up getting to that point. One of the other positives that maybe we didn't talk about here is that, and this can go both ways because the last bullet on the negatives is about impact to businesses. So there is some benefit to congestion with businesses. There are more eyes and windows if you're moving at a slower pace to retail and things that are on the side of the road. So there are some retail users that will like slower moving vehicles going past their businesses. Other negatives, there tends to be some frustration that comes with congestion, which can increase the number of incidents or crashes because people will get frustrated and want to shoot gaps and be more risky in their behaviors. They also will tend to get frustrated and find other alternatives, other roadways, meaning instead of staying on US 2 or Fifth Ave, they will use local streets, neighborhood streets to do cut throughs and to do different things to get away from that congestion. Air pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. So this is more of a sustainability thing. We know that stop and go vehicles create more greenhouse gas emissions. We know that stopped vehicles create more greenhouse gas emissions than cars that are continually moving at an efficient speed. So that is a downside of that as well. And then we talked about that business side of things already.
Okay, back to goals. Just wanted to highlight these again in the conversations that we've been having about the data component and the solutions moving forward. The goals that are underlined are really leading us to that balanced approach, as well as goal 8, noting that we agreed in our multimodal plan that we need to proactively plan for an increase in demand. And I think that as we move forward with our comprehensive plan update, taking a look at these goals again is certainly a healthy exercise and continuing to keep them in the forefront of our decisions. So now we're transitioning we're on our final section. I said at the beginning, this is a 4-part presentation, we're on the fourth section, which is that long-term east-west connection. But before we talk about the long-term, which I'm going to have Preston do, I'll give just a very short bit and reminder that we have a short-term solution that is also in the plan. It's figure 22. And really the only change from the condition that we have today versus the short-term plan that's in the multimodal plan is moving the signal that's at Church down to Pine to provide that two-way travel on Pine Street between 4th and 5th, with the intent of really providing back to that layered system of networks, providing a viable pathway for east-west traffic to help avoid what's happening with cut-through traffic through South Sandpoint. There are a lot of different ways to try and address that problem. On Lake Street, there were some stop signs put in to help detract people from going on Lake Street vehicles, but allowing it to be more of a friendly route for bicycles and pedestrians, which is included as a route within the multimodal plan. There are ways to put do not enter signs on Superior at First Avenue, which we had a lot of conversations about and included in the short-term solution. The other aspect of this is really looking at that Bridge and First solution. So we have our downtown revitalization phase 3 project coming forward. And so when we anticipate getting that from concept to design, continuing our revitalization on First Avenue that we started a couple years ago and moving that project south, looking at that intersection so that we're planning for the future in that regard from an infrastructure perspective, and widening those sidewalks in this short term. So as the downtown revitalization project moves forward, there'll be a lot more community involvement in that final design and what that looks like. That's just an example of how we take a concept that's in the multimodal plan and we advance it through with more details and more certainty for the community and the adjacent businesses. We also have some turn restrictions on Pine and Euclid for everyone in our community that has been heading southbound on 5th Avenue. The community feedback we heard is it's really quite a hazard actually to be coming around that curve and having someone stopped in the middle of the highway trying to take a left turn given the limited sight visibility there. So again, those were really community driven requested changes. The signal at one interesting point that I appreciate the mayor pointing out is that when we were designing the project with ITD between 2011 and 2013, the city actually strongly requested that we not have the signal at Church. We wanted it at Pine Street at that time, and the data didn't support it. ITD ran the data and said that the intersection failed and it wasn't a viable option. That's why we have the signal at Church. So moving forward through the multimodal planning effort, because this location was still a concern by our community, because the bottleneck, if you will, where vehicles on Pine have to go north on 4th and then turn left on Church to get out into Dover, and that's having an unintended consequence in our South Sandpoint area. Our team, OTAC, as well as Preston and his folks spent a lot of time and effort re-looking at that data. And we had multiple meetings with ITD and actually handed over all of the raw data to them for their signal engineers and analysts to review our team's work to see if they agreed, because they were also a little concerned that back 10 years ago, their data said that it didn't work. Our data proves that it does. The result of that, and Preston could certainly answer questions to this, is in our multimodal plan on page 58, it does note that with the implementation of this, that intersection at Pine and 5th will function worse than it does today, meaning the level of service from that technical perspective goes down when we do this. And the sole reason for that is because today it is not a controlled intersection, it's free flow. So anything we do at that location is going to make it worse. But again, we're really doing it to help provide that east-west connection, which I do want to note that in the 2012 community-driven plan, the downtown streets plan and guide really emphasized the importance of an east-west connection as well. Preston, anything else you want to add on our short-term solution?
No, I think you hit things pretty well there. Maybe one note that is really critical is that with that signal at Pine and 5th now, and its closer proximity to Boyer, where that signal sits today, it's gonna be really important that those two signals are talking to one another, are coordinated really well, because as we know today, that queue does back up to Pine already. So and based on our modeling, we can show that it works if they have those well coordinated. So that will be important as we work with ITD to make sure that they get those signals talking really well with one another.
Great, thank you. As far as timing goes, just for council, a reminder, the design for the signal at Fifth and Pine is in this year's fiscal year budget. So we are actively moving forward, engaging engineers to design that signal, sign an agreement with ITD to solidify their review process in that, but it is city funds that would be paying for the design and the signal. And the reason for that is, again, it's a city request. It is in no way, shape, or form requested by ITD for their system to function. In fact, all of the signals on US 2 are because they fundamentally serve our system. So a truly car-centric and typical highway environment would be no signals. That would achieve a mobility goal for vehicles, but because we need to get vehicles out through our town, that's why we need controlled intersections based upon the volume, similar to what we did at Pine and Division a few years ago. So as many people will recall, Pine and Division, we had a lot of safety issues and a lot of near misses as well as incidents, and it was really unsafe for our pedestrians and school kids that were coming in and out of school. And so the first level, if you will, of control that we put at that intersection was making it a four-way stop. So rather than putting in a signal or a roundabout or some of those other costly measures, it's a phased approach. And right now, that intersection, I believe the last we checked it through one of our recent analysis, is it's functioning at an A. So, hopefully that it continues to do that despite the increase in demands. And so similar at these signals, it's the volume that's requiring signals at some locations. Anything to add on that, Preston?
No, got it.
Okay. So responsible growth or responsible planning for growth in the next 20 years, we need to address really two things: A, growth in the region and the city, and B, our citizens' concerns. So not only do we have this aspect of ADT and some of the projections that Preston went over, what we fundamentally heard through our multimodal planning efforts, from one-on-one conversations to workshops to surveys, is just over and over again these concerns that are listed here, 1 through 8. The multimodal plan includes more, but these are the key takeaways, I would say. So I'm going to just briefly go over them really quick and then pass it back over to Preston to go over how the plan intends to resolve these 8 factors. Pedestrian safety crossing at US 2 and Boyer due to that skewed intersection. Preston reminded everyone that having those tee up is really the safest solution there. Safety concerns for all users due to the alignment of the community trail at US 2 and Boyer, and safety concerns due to that location of Pine and Boyer intersection and how close it is to US 2 and Boyer. Our neighborhood concerns of cut through traffic east-west through South Sandpoint. Frustration about the signal timing at church. I can't tell you how many calls we get at the city saying, why don't you just change that signal? The timing's terrible. Per our agreement, that's not an option. And we all know that during the peak seasons, during summer, it's often backed up all the way to Joel's at 2nd Avenue on Church. So frustration about one-way section of Pine Street between 4th and 5th and wanting to avoid the multiple turns. The failure of the bridge and 1st Avenue, all users, or as some people call it, dysfunction junction. And number 8, concerns that the future of US 2 may become similar to that section north of Cedar. For many, many years, we've been saying we don't want that. So this list handed over to Preston and his technical team, as well as OTAC and their experts as well. Figure 23 is attempting to solve those 8 things. It's not just about volume and how we're handling cars. It was really intended to look at this list and come up with resolutions to all of them, which is why in one figure, we're seeing various solutions at Bridge and 1st and Superior. Preston can speak more to it. The one quick note I would make before handing it over, back to the phased approach of controlled intersections, I think I can speak for the entire community on this, which I rarely try to do, but I don't think anybody wants signals at Superior and First or at Pine and First. The goal isn't that we're preferring signals, it's that at the point at which the system is no longer functioning and we have to have some form of a controlled intersection, what does that solution look like? And so Preston, maybe you could start on that bottom right-hand side and kind of work your way northwest, if you will, and talk about the various things that you looked at those intersections.
Sure. So Superior Street and First Ave. It's a funky intersection. There's some weird movements going on and it's controlled in a strange way as well, which makes it confusing in general. It's a gateway into and out of town, which makes it even more difficult that you have users who are coming in for the first time, oftentimes who are not familiar with the network and are confused as they approach this intersection. So there are some recommendations to restrict some movements there in the short term. And in the long term, you do see a signal there. So that's a when warranted situation. That's not a you shall do this. This is a if you get to the point of the volume of warranting, then we need to put a signal in here to control things. Still with some restricted movements. The restricted movements are there to keep the cut through from occurring from Superior, kind of coming off of the byway and going into Superior into the South Sandpoint area. And just kind of as a side note, there's about 2,000 trips a day that are cutting through there. And I know some of those are local trips, but in general, there's 2,000 volume going west or on that western side of that intersection. If we were to do nothing and keep that the way it is today, that would increase to about 5,000 in 2040. So more than double. And I don't think any of us want that in that neighborhood. That's not the purpose of Superior at that point. That is a local street to the west of First Ave, and we want to maintain that. In order to maintain that, we need to restrict some movements and force the general public to the north on First Ave to get to Pine, to our new two-way arterial. Well, going up to Pine and First, Amanda mentioned that today that's an all-way stop. And as we convert to two-way, that portion of Pine is two-way already today. But as that continues to increase in traffic as a result of that being two-way all the way through, that will likely as well warrant a signal in the future. And when we say long-term, we're generally thinking in the 15 to 20 year range is generally how we're thinking through these. And generally that's what's warranting these conditions is that are those years out into the future. Jumping up onto First and Bridge. We didn't talk about the short-term condition in that, but the short-term condition there is to restrict movements there. And that would be from westbound heading on Bridge Street, going to southbound. That left turn movement causes a lot of issues there. And by restricting that movement with certain barriers on First Ave, whether they're planter barriers or some other temporary form that can be moved out during off-peak seasons. So that can be a temporary just peak season condition where we have those barriers in place to restrict those movements, and those can look nice in, they can be troughs with flowers or whatever you want to create for that condition. In the long term, there needs to be something more than that. And it also comes into play for your pedestrian and bicycle activity in this downtown area, and getting those pedestrians and bikes over to the beach in a safe manner. And by having this condition of closing First Ave, it creates I'm calling it a void, because right now it looks like a void between those two orange elbow areas of that intersection. That becomes basically a pedestrian plaza that kind of like a festival area that could be used for all sorts of things, or it could just be used for bicycle and pedestrian activity to cross through. But it becomes a nice area to liven up and have a safe crossing, and at the same time have more efficient flow in and out of Bridge Beach area as well as the downtown area on the other side. Let's see, let's move over to, we'll go up to Oak Street and work our way down. So Oak Street, we talked about in the simulations where that portion in between the couplet area becomes bike and pedestrian zone only, so no vehicles in that section. The Pine and Fifth convert to one way, so that's the couplet in general, where we have one way northbound and one way southbound between the two split couplets. And then Pine, okay, so that section between the two Pine signals, so between number 1 and then Boyer over there, that becomes two-way. And we wanted to call that out because that is a difference from the original curve that ITD had put together, that was going to maintain a one-way street through there, which really wasn't conducive to good circulation for us. It caused a lot of out of direction travel. And we wanted to maintain that and that good east-west connection there. So maintaining a two-way travel through that. And then lastly, the Boyer realignment to clean things up there from short spacing between the intersections that creates some unsafe conditions, that creates some very congested conditions with very long queues into the future that we're trying to clean up with this realignment. I think that summarizes most everything.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
For Amanda or Preston, I had heard something about the bike lane. With this being the long-term planning, can you show us where the bike lanes would be if you're on South Sandpoint, or if you're just south of Highway 2, or if you're just north of Highway 2? How would you get down to City Beach via bicycle?
I can try and take that one, and then Preston can certainly chime in if needed. The route for bicycles that's in our figure in Appendix A to get to City Beach is actually, there's two routes. So the city has for a long time said that Oak Street is our primary route, east-west to First Avenue and then south on First Avenue to get to City Beach. However, a lot of folks that live in South Sandpoint, or if you're over there by City Hall, for example, going up to Oak isn't always the preferred route. So sticking more on Lake was a result of our planning efforts, would be the primary routes for bicycles. And then we have a number of routes actually throughout that entire corridor for pedestrians. Almost every section there ends up being a pedestrian route. And then our pedestrian priority network route provides for sidewalk connectivity from the west side all the way to City Beach.
Thank you.
Any other questions or things you want to add, Preston?
I don't think so.
Actually, I have a question, Preston, from our prior workshops that we hosted. There were a lot of concerns about at that bridge and first intersection. We'll have to take a deep dive, but that southbound traffic on First that's north of Bridge Street, how are they going to get out of town?
Yeah, so the nice part about the downtown area is you do have your grid system. So you have Second Ave, Third Ave, Fourth Ave as your north-south connections. And then you have Church and Oak as your east-west and Cedar. So now that without that connection on First Ave, you now have the option of second, third, or fourth, and you'll have opportunities to connect to Pine Street from any of those three locations.
Perfect. So this is a quick summary comparing the prior, I put in quotes, curve compared to the east-west connection. So the design project, the ITD design project that the city and ITD coordinated on between 2011 and 2013 compared to the long-term east-west connection. So on the far left column is a list just trying to capture and summarize the various factors that played into the east-west connection and how those concerns from the community were not addressed through the curve project. Even though both concepts or both the east-west connection as well as the designed curve both have couplets, they both split northbound and southbound traffic for all of the reasons that we previously discussed. There's a couple things that the curve didn't achieve that the east-west does. So I'll just highlight these really quickly and we could certainly touch on them in more detail if we need to. But US 2 at Pine, so it's not a controlled intersection in the curve, no signal. Pine was a one-way from Boyer to Fourth. And the east-west connection, it's a controlled signal, as Preston just reviewed, and it's two-way between Boyer and First Avenue. If you think of that section of Pine right now, today, it's almost like putting a valve on the system and closing the valve. So it's sending traffic to another direction. We're trying to open that valve with the east-west connection. The Boyer intersection in the curve project was laid out in the same manner, as I mentioned earlier, that it is today. And it impacted Dubs. So it provided connection to South Boyer, and it impacted Dubs. In the east-west connection that's in the multimodal plan, there's no access, as Preston mentioned, from what would be westbound on US 2. And actually, there's no, Preston, you can certainly talk more about the access at South Boyer. I know we had a right on to US 2 from South Boyer, but that connection, I think the skew still of that intersection without impacting Dubs was a bit challenging. So we looked at the area between Winter Ridge and Dubs to help provide some of that connectivity through the plan. US 2 and Church in the curve design was a signal. In the east-west connection, there is no signal. This was a big one for our community, and reading back on that history, we were really frustrated that Oak Street was that short section and provided access for vehicles. In the east-west connection, it's closed. As Preston, I think, went over in great detail the opportunities and why we chose to close that. Boyer and Pine, in the curve example, it's the same as today. It's really close to US 2. The east-west connection, by moving that intersection of Boyer further to the east, we're not only fixing the skew alignment that's noted below, but we're also helping to address that issue at Pine and Boyer as well. US 2 Community Trail, big point of contention during the curve feedback, did not care for the safety concerns that we had for pedestrians at the poor visibility that we experienced today, and the skew still existed. The realignment of the community trail and the east-west connection is intended to resolve that connectivity. And Dubs Field, as it's often referred to. So the curve project, again, did not impact it. They're restricted, as we discussed, from impacting a park. However, the city has the ability to say it's okay to impact the park. So we, in the east-west connection, utilized a significant portion of the park. The T-ball, as it's currently used for primarily today, doesn't require that big of a footprint. Property acquisition. So the curve project had multiple businesses that needed to be acquired, as well as parking lots, et cetera, to accomplish the plan. And the east-west connection, really, we charged Preston with that long list here, and we said, go forth with solutions that have the least amount of impact on businesses as possible. And with that priority in mind, we resulted in a plan that impacted, when adopted, a single business, which is Melody Muffler. And they seem to be, I think I can say this for them, quite excited to maybe retire at some point soon. So they were not opposed to being acquired through the east-west connection, quite the opposite. On the curve project, it did account for 2 lanes in each direction plus turn lanes. We did communicate that we were concerned about that. And the east-west connection, as Preston mentioned, from a cartoon perspective, we showed that there's lanes. However, they were not designed in the east-west connection by any means, as where the curve project was designed. And both solutions include complete streets features. Anything else, Preston, you want to add on this list that I may have missed?
Nope, you got it.
Okay. So on February 1st, City Council made the decision to purchase the Dubs property. As many of you will recall, that decision was coupled with a request to amend Figure 23, simply to add what connection to South Boyer would look like, as Preston previously described, teeing up the intersection with South Boyer and US 2. So still a concept, but we did verify functionality to make sure, as Preston mentioned, that this movement wouldn't negatively affect the Boyer US 2 intersection, to make sure that was still a viable path forward. So that was the only change to the multimodal plan that we wanted to articulate the importance of that connection to South Boyer so that Washington Elementary could still be accessed and the festival and all of those residents still have that connectivity. As we're in the adopted plan, again, the priority was no impact to Dubs. So since then, as the mayor highlighted at the very beginning of this presentation and workshop, that there's been a bit of confusion since the city made the decision to acquire that property, and trying to address some of that confusion about figure 23, we as staff have tried to incorporate what we heard the most from council, city council from. And so again, the revised figure 23 includes that connectivity to South Boyer Avenue from US 2. So that's the same as what was presented on February 1st. Since February 1st, based upon city council feedback, we've done 2 additional changes to it. That's just simply to remove all references to travel lanes. So we've stated it, the plan, the multimodal plan doesn't talk about number of lanes. So to further bring home the point that that was never the intent of the multimodal plan to design number of lanes on a state-owned highway, all lane references are gone in the recently updated, not adopted, but just recently updated draft. And to provide some notations to further clarify the importance of pedestrian and bicycle safety and connectivity. That is stated throughout the entire multimodal plan, from the vision to the goals, all the way through to every concept that is included in the plan. So the intent is to come back to City Council on May 3rd at their regular meeting and request that they consider amending the multimodal plan to update it to reflect the changes that may occur as a result of the purchase of the Dubs property. And at that time, as the mayor mentioned earlier, as with majority of decisions by City Council, that is when we take public comment on potential decisions. So again, this session was really more from an informational perspective. The updated version, this is it. It was included in the staff report. So again, all lane references are gone. You still see on the lower left there, the connection through the Dubs property as a result of the acquisition. And then up here on the right-hand side is the reference to Appendix B, which is the complete streets policy, as well as just noting that the ultimate roadway and intersection geometry will be determined by further data and analysis from ITD. So kind of back to this location where we were contemplating some of the amazing things that could happen in that space. Roadway geometry, as Preston can speak to, is really looking at not only just the I can't even speak anymore. I've been talking so much. The lane widths, but also the shoulder size. Where are our bike lanes going to go? How will parking interface or not interface? How will stormwater exist? What type of trees are we going to be planting? So all of those levels of detail that as this project potentially progresses in the future, should money for design actually be funded, that's when we really start working through that level of detail. And we have to look at the geometry component of it is specific to turn movements, for example. So how those lanes and turn lanes and the spacing, how far back they're set from a signal. It's really looking at truly a technical engineering perspective, as well as all of those other components to a complete street that are so important to our community. Preston, do you want to say anything else about roadway geometry that I failed to mention?
I do not.
Okay. So as a reminder from earlier in the presentation today, I think there's many examples that support couplet solutions. A couplet solution was back to, we kind of have 3 options: get rid of all the traffic through our town. But when most of the traffic is originating through our town, that's going to take some pretty significant decisions. Option 2 is to just simply widen the highway, which I don't know anyone in our community that's advocated for that. And the third option is to split traffic, like many communities have done in downtowns, and yet still achieve that walker's paradise. And this is the last slide, which is just a snapshot from the staff report that is noting what I just basically stated. which is that the purpose of amending the figure 23 concept was just to inform the beginning of a redesign process about how US 2 connects with our city streets. And ITD's current design solution is still a couplet. It's the designed solution that we agreed to in the exhibit that we showed, which is through the railroad right-of-way, previous railroad right-of-way, now purchased by ITD. And the city's request for advancing this redesign potentially to ITD is to provide the community and the businesses with certainty. So instead of reading the words, I'm just going to say it really simply. The idea is, yes, we have this concept in a multimodal plan. The community wants to dive in and give more feedback on the devil's in the details. So we all want to talk about those details. The city doesn't have money, nor is it our highway to start that design process. The intent is to say, ITD, we would really like to have a design for this that we're all okay with. So can we start that process? And that requires funding, obviously. And so, and it's their highway. So it's relaunching, redesigning that process that we did back in 2011 and 2013 that we never really came to a great place with. So how can we advance that? And then the city's concept as reflected in 23 is really not just about resolving what's happening on a state system, but it's about resolving our citizens' concerns regarding cut through traffic as well as safety pedestrians and bicycle safety. So hopefully all of that enhanced some understanding. And I think, Mr. Mayor, do we have a recess before questions, or I'll hand it back over to you?
We're going to take a quick recess and then we'll come back to questions from the public. So we will reconvene here at about 9:28. Okay, we're reconvened here at almost 9:30. Thank you, everyone, for sticking it out thus far. We've got a lot of really thoughtful questions from the public, and staff has consolidated them as best as possible. Of course, many of them have already been answered, and we will try to answer those that have not been answered. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Jennifer.
I'm gonna whisper in her that, just to clarify it for you, he's wanting to know what the current purchase of does. Will they look at doing the intersection to have Pleasure Grove straight through?
Preston, do you want to start with one I handed you?
Yeah, I'll just do this one, then Jennifer can. Yeah. So. This was it's a printed off copy from the Virginia Transportation Research Council regarding guidelines for using streetlight data for planning tasks. And the portion that was highlighted here, and this is about utilizing this big data, the streetlight cell phone data for planning purposes of estimating ADT, origin destination trips, traffic flow, turning movements at intersections and truck traffic. And the portion that was highlighted here states the evaluation results were mixed. The latest, talking about the results of their research of this, the latest streetlight AADT estimates showed relatively small absolute percentage errors, whereas using the streetlight metrics to estimate D trips, which is origin destination, traffic counts on roadway segments and at intersections and truck traffic did not show a relatively low and stable error rate. Large percentage errors were often found to be associated with lower volume levels estimated based on the streetlight metrics. In addition, using the streetlight metrics from individual periods as the input for estimating these traffic measures resulted in large errors. Instead, the aggregation of data from multi-periods helped reduce the errors, especially for low volume conditions. Depending on project purposes, the aggregation can be based on metrics of multiple days, weeks, or months. So yeah, good comment here regarding when we talked about our streetlight data, looking at origin, destination, and distribution of trips and pass through. So what this is saying from the research from this institution is that streetlight essentially shouldn't be used to give you intersection turning movement counts directly. And it shouldn't be used to estimate truck traffic or really absolute values of any of those sort of traffics, which is why we don't use it in that way. We use streetlight data as an order of magnitude and use it in terms of percentages of traffic rather than saying it is this much traffic on this roadway, because we know it's just a sampling. Not everyone has a cell phone, not everyone has their cell phone turned on, not everyone has it enabled to send signals. So there's lots of things coming into play where it's not 100% sample size of what you're pulling from. And the other reason why we pull a whole 12 months of data is for that reason that they talk about, to reduce that error, because you do get a lot of error if you're just looking at a day time frame versus a whole year, 365 days time frame, aggregating that together to get you an average, which is why we use it for order of magnitude of generally what's that percentage of trips.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Mayor. We've got a good probably 20-30 questions. I would note too that we had a few questions that were submitted, and we've had a couple individuals email us and tell us that they're going to pull their questions because they were answered already in the presentation, and they appreciated that. So we have gotten a couple of those emails, but and talking with Preston here as well. There's a few of these that are detailed questions. We don't necessarily have all the data right now. So some of these we may not be able to answer tonight because we don't have the data. It'll be a future process. And as possible with some of these questions, what we may hear back is we will have to answer back in writing, because we don't write now tonight with a quick answer, but we might, in the next week. So, and if that is the case, and we go to any written answers, those will be posted on our website, connections on our social media, so people can see those. So with that, first question is from a community member in the room asking about the acquisition of Dubs, and does it potentially modify the Boyer crossing of Highway 2? So Amanda and Mayor, maybe we can go back again to that intersection and a question about the Boyer crossing at Highway 2 with the purchase of Dubs.
Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen and get that presentation back up so we can flip through. Full screen now on your end?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go to the zoomed in section.
Yep.
So the answer is yes. So the purchase of Dubs, this alignment in the proposed amended figure 23 would reflect this connectivity at this location, providing, as Preston previously addressed, a left turn movement from US to southbound on South Boyer, as well as the right in and the right out. So yes, the acquisition allowed for this versus here, you can see that connectivity is not shown.
Amanda, I think at least how I interpreted that question, it was more about, are we going to revisit this, this connection like this, is how I gathered that.
Yes.
Then I'll hand that over to you, Preston. Thank you for clarifying.
So the reason that the importance of this improvement here is about the east-west connection. It's about continuing that east-west grid that was lost for so long because of the one-way and reducing the cut through the neighborhoods. And what this doesn't do is help fix the issues of the short distance between now or still with the Pine intersection here and Boyer. You still have that issue there where we would essentially still be having the issue of long queues coming up here because of this issue here. So it doesn't fix one of the problems at the intersection. So I would say no, likely this does not bring that back into light.
I think a couple other factors with that, Preston, just to chime in, is it would potentially require additional right-of-way acquisition, as well as doesn't address the skewed factors that were resolved by pushing it to the east, if that's a fair statement.
Yep. Yeah, we'd be affecting more businesses, I guess, over in here.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor and Amanda, I'm gonna stay right there in that intersection again with another question. With a question about traffic considerations and concerns right there again at Boyer and Highway 2. And wondering about considerations or data that were taken under advisement regarding pedestrian traffic from South Boyer across Highway 2. And there's a second question on seeking to understand how moving the traffic light change, how would that affect potentially morning and afternoon school drop off and pickup for Washington Elementary?
Mr. Mayor, would you like me to try to tackle that one in conjunction with Preston? So I'll handle the second part of the question, I think, first, if that's okay. I'm going to go back to another slide we have at the beginning. And maybe Preston, you can speak to that Ella connection as well.
Yeah. So the Ella connection is really what's going to help continue our connectivity to South Sandpoint, in addition to this portion of South Boyer. But I know that there is some, it does get cut a little bit there with in that Boyer section from North Boyer to South Boyer. So the new Ella connection that's shown on the screen there, it's hard to see with that small figure, but this is a new connection that is now providing that good north-south connection, north and south of US 2 to South Sandpoint, and obviously over to Washington Elementary. So that is and that does not exist today. So today that is a dead end. So that increases connectivity from north to south. And then what was the other portion of the comment?
The data component of pedestrians at the Boyer intersection. I know we've counted pedestrian data at several locations throughout town as a result of some of our developments in the pipeline. Do you recall if we have pedestrian data at that location?
Yeah, we do. So anywhere where we have pedestrian data, anything that we've collected recently in traffic volumes includes traffic volumes and pedestrians, number of pedestrians and bikes crossing the crosswalks, or as a bike, if they're in the road, acting as a vehicle in the road. So those are all included into the analysis. What you probably couldn't see in the simulation is you'll see the pedestrians actually crossing the crosswalks at that intersection at the realigned Boyer, as well as the community path next to it. So those are all being accounted for, meaning cars needing to yield to those pedestrians and crosswalks, and the resulting delay that would occur to vehicles as a result of pedestrians being in the crosswalks is being accounted for in the analysis.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to keep us at the same spot. I'm trying to get these grouped together so we can stay in the same location.
Great.
There's a question regarding Boyer and Highway 2 again, and how travel on Boyer across Highway 2 will be accommodated without a traffic light at that intersection.
At Boyer and Highway 2, how there would not be a traffic signal?
Correct. I think there's not an understanding of what you're doing with a traffic signal.
I see. Okay. So, and yeah, there still is a traffic signal at Boyer and US 2. It's just shifted to the east. So it's currently here where my cursor is today, and it simply gets shifted further to the east. So if you were on Boyer coming from the north, you would take a left onto Pine to be at your intersection with US 2.
Okay. Thank you. Another question is asking about impacts by limiting north-south access from Boyer again, crossing Highway 2.
Yeah, Preston, correct me if I'm wrong here, please, but my sense is it was trying to enhance that connectivity, not eliminate it. So I think that, again, maybe just a little bit of confusion. It's not trying to eliminate any crossing here. It's shifting the crossing to this location.
Shifting the crossing to the location, and with the amendment that is proposed to be put in the MTMP is that oops, sorry. Yeah, there you go. Is enhancing that access now by allowing left turns in this direction. So this will be what we call a 3/4 access, meaning all movements but left turns out would be allowed. And if you want to do a left turn out to go southwest on US 2, you're likely going to Ella to the new signal that would be at that location, depending on where you're coming from. If you're further south, Sandpoint, maybe using Division or Ella. So those are your options.
From a pedestrian perspective, Preston, could you give a very brief explanation? Because I've heard you do a really good job on it before about how pedestrians crossing at an actual signal is safer than having, for example, an RFB at this location or a flashing beacon or some other method.
Yeah, so, well, in general, sidewalks here, crosswalk over that portion of Boyer, sidewalk continuing up. And then you come to your intersection, and then you have your multi-use path on this side, doing the same thing, coming up to the intersection, crossing at the crosswalk there, crossing the crosswalk here, having a crosswalk here, and connecting to sidewalk on this side, and then sidewalks on this side, crossing on this end. So it's all interconnected. And then when you have the opportunity to have a crossing at a signal, you want to take advantage of that rather than having something mid-block and close to the intersection, because then you start to mess up your operations in general. You don't want to have a protected crossing for pedestrians and bikes within, 100 feet of an intersection where there's already queues backing up past it and causing issues with queues backing up into your signal there and causing that issue. So let's keep the pedestrians at the marked crosswalks. They get their walk time built into your signal, whether your walk phase, your little person indication, and then your countdown walk time on your pedestrian heads. So those are things that motorists should be. I know it's not all the time, and you can't say that for any crossing location, but motorists should be watching for those locations. They're at a red light in most cases, and right turns need to yield to those in there, and left turns need to yield to pedestrians. So it would act as a protected crossing on all 4 legs of that intersection.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
We are going to go a bit west on Highway 2 then, with a question about do the concepts anticipate widening Highway 2 in the direction from Doves to Newport?
I can take that one. The answer is no. We have a separate figure for that, and there's no lane contemplation from the west.
Okay, while we are on in west then of Doves, there is a question regarding the additional traffic that will result from the new apartments at Ridley Village and Highway 2. And what was planned in this concept to allow for ease of entry from Ridley Village onto Highway 2.
So our concept doesn't contemplate that development specifically in respect to that development became about after we adopted the multimodal plan. However, part of approving that project in looking at potential impact fees, if you will, how can they offset their impact on our system as they go about developing, did require a traffic impact analysis. And I'll give it my best go on an answer and then turn it back over to Preston. But what our multimodal plan did consider is actually restricting access off of majority of our side streets that intersect with Highway 2 west of Boyer. In looking at how we can improve safety throughout that corridor, those left turn movements in and out are really where we have our highest conflict points, and that creates the most congestion. So back to how can we change behavior to help prevent widening a corridor? One of the first responses is access management. How do we limit how many points of connection we have along that Highway 2 area? So ultimately, it is intended, as far as I am aware, that at some point in the future, Highway 2 west of Boyer would have a center turn lane, similar to what we've discussed on Boyer Avenue in front of the University Place development, really to accommodate some of those left turn movements into the developments and private uses of those versus the streets, if that makes sense. So reduce the number of access points so that we have more access availability to some of the other development aspects of that. Preston, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I can't speak to that development specifically. In their traffic study, if they were required to do one, should be addressing that specifically and accommodating what's in the multimodal master plan in their traffic studies for individual developments. That's the point of this, is to act as the guiding document for traffic studies that are required for developments to be done and how they access their site. And Amanda hit it on the head. It's about access management. We don't want multiple driveways or multiple streets intersecting on US 2 that then diminishes its ability to do what it needs to do as a principal arterial in the city. So that's the point. We don't want to create multiple driveways. We want to control at major intersections, with other locations being right in, right out restricted, with the occasional left turns in, to maintain that efficient flow and maintain the good safety, as well as reduce the number of crossings of our community path and sidewalks. By the community path on that one side is going to be really nice, with limited interruptions of crossing streets, except right your major collectors and arterials that it's intersecting with. So that's the other major benefit of access management.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Amanda, the next question, probably Amanda, it's you. Is ITD planning to replace the Highway 2 bridge in Dover to expand the lanes?
The Highway 2 bridge in Dover, it's already expanded to accommodate additional capacity in the future. So no, they don't have plans to further expand it, if I understand the question correctly.
Correct. And then it relates to a secondary question, which I think you've addressed, but I'm going to kick it over to you again. There's a question why the city's proposed concept for Highway 2 would have more lanes than the Dover Bridge can accommodate.
Yeah, the Dover Bridge, which is on that west entrance point, is significantly wider for the future to be able to accommodate additional lanes than it does today. The multimodal plan does not suggest more lanes within city limits of Sandpoint than what is at the bridge. So that's an inaccurate assessment.
Mr. Mayor, I
Yeah.
think they might be talking about the bridge that goes over the slough. And confusing it with the actual Dover Bridge. In the first part of that question, when they're talking about widening,
It's specific.
I was wondering that as well in the part
they
that got
might think that other part of the slough is in Dover.
gotcha. So yeah, the first bridge that you actually come to if you were leaving Sandpoint heading to Dover is across the slough, as Councilor Rule points out, and it is only 2 lanes. I am not aware of any plans at this point to widen that. No.
Okay, thank you. You may be correct. Said Dover, but
Well, I don't think they could think the Dover Bridge was gonna get any bigger, but
what?
it's already the Death Star.
Next question, what route would be expected for someone traveling from Upper West Pine? So kind of the SWAC YMCA area, to Winter Ridge?
Typically, it would be to use a collector, which would be Pine. So all the way continue eastbound on Pine, similar as you would do today, and maneuver through the intersection in the future by taking a right turn onto US 2 and then taking a left turn onto South Boyer. Alternatively, one could head southbound on Division, head westbound on Highway 2, and take a right into Winter Ridge.
Or you could go eastbound on Pine and then southbound on Ella. And then.
And that signals
eastbound
in.
on Highway 2,
Mhm.
yeah, that might
Yeah.
be the fastest actually.
I would point out that those three options are in comparison today where you have approximately 92 options for how to get from SWAC to Sprinter, creating what we call the paradox of choice.
Yeah.
And every time I leave my house, I face the paradox of choice because I have 100 options for how to get to the other side of town. So yes, one thing that this does is it creates collectors and it creates minor arterials, which we don't currently have. So we hear all about pass-through traffic, cut-through traffic all the time. The cut-through traffic exists because we're not giving people good routes. We're giving them 100 bad routes.
Great point.
Hey, I should have addressed it to you, Counselor. So we have a number of questions in the couplet area, so I can kind of group those. So I think we'll get kind of into the downtown core with the couplet. There was a question about whether or not the city had analyzed local air quality impacts from the proposed couplet, and I believe you addressed that briefly in the simulation.
Yeah, air quality is a little bit different calculation, which is not included in any of this that we've done anyway. Greenhouse gas emission calculations were derived from vehicle miles traveled estimations, which was not a metric evaluated here. It's something that could be evaluated, no doubt, to see what that impact is, but hasn't been to date.
Thank you. Another one in the couplet area, your simulations that were shown tonight showed a significant traffic congestion at 20,000 vehicles per day in a do nothing scenario. And the question is, what type of congestion existed in 2010 pre-bypass when numbers were up at that level?
Preston, I think that's probably a question for you. I'm not sure if I know we have ADT, but I'm not sure if we have level of service in 2010. Do you?
No, I don't, and wasn't around to verify that for sure, how that looked and felt, but
I just remembered we have it in the urban area transportation plan actually from 2009. So that is a question that we could do a little bit of homework on and maybe answer online.
That would be a good question for a written answer.
Yes.
You came out with that. Chief is really lucky because I was just gonna call him up.
You could ask anybody who lived here in 2009 what First and Cedar were like back then. It's not pleasant.
No.
I miss the cows and the pigs. Just kidding.
It's getting late.
Past my bedtime, everybody. I'm losing it.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to summarize and get us through these as quickly as possible.
Take your time.
I think there is a misunderstanding with this question that came through online. So Amanda, I'm going to direct this one over to you again. Regarding the proposed concept at First and Superior to US 2, why would the city propose a truck cut through when the intention was to eliminate large commercial truck traffic from Sandpoint's downtown?
100% the goal. In fact, I will admit that Chief and I both might follow trucks to better understand why they're going through our downtown today when they have such a beautiful alternate route. So the reason goes back to, in reality, drivers are following typically what their Google app tells them to follow. So when the path of least resistance is through our downtown area to get, for example, if you were on Division or in Dover and you wanted to go to Sagal or Coeur d'Alene and you're a truck, your Google map is not going to send you north to get onto the byway and then head south. While I think that is a really good intention, at this point, it's not warranted. The volume doesn't warrant that type of restriction. As far as when you're in Sagal and you want to go to Dover, for example, or you want to head north through the downtown section, that again is what we're seeing more often than not, is vehicles taking that exit in lieu of going north just to head back south because it's the path of least resistance. So with this plan, the solution to really get to the crux of the question there is to provide east-west connection. It is not to encourage truck traffic. Should truck traffic volume get to be where we have pigs and cattle, as we've been referring to all night, and whole, trucks coming through that area, we do have options in the future to have conversations with ITD, for example, about restricting everything but local deliveries on 95, restricting further movements through Pine Street. It does take data to support that. And as of right now, the data doesn't support restricting that traffic. Preston, do you want to correct me there if I misstated anything? You're welcome to.
No, you're good there. Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Staying kind of in that area. Next question. Wouldn't traffic back up quickly between 5th and 6th on Pine with the two lights so close together?
Preston, that's you.
Yeah, we kind of talked about that briefly at the end of the presentation about the importance of, well, I'll talk about it in two different ways. We'll talk about in the short term when the signal's still here in that distance, because right now that's actually more concerning to me than the future condition. So the short-term condition, when the signal's still at Boyer and that distance there, it will be imperative that ITD coordinates their signals so they talk to one another, so that the predominant movement in that situation is being served, so that we don't have queues spilling back into one another. In the long term, it's much less of an issue, and you saw a little bit of that in the simulations, that we didn't see vehicles queuing up past the halfway mark in that condition. And because this is a T intersection right here without a fourth leg, you can run your intersection much more efficiently with phasing. You have, not to get too technical on signal timing, but you have less phases in your timing, so you can run it more efficiently through that system. So in this case, we can always push traffic through when we need to without having that back up into that intersection. And we have restricted movements as well, where this is a three-leg. I don't know where that came from. We have a three-legged intersection here, but this is one way in one direction. So it's almost like a two-phase signal in the east-west direction only. And then at this one, we don't have traffic going northbound, since this is one way southbound. So we're able to operate it much more efficiently by reducing the number of phases in that signal timing system to reduce that propensity for having queuing spilling back.
Thanks.
While we're talking about signals, can we address what type of signals would be contemplated as shown in the concepts? There's some specificity and concern about two-phase signals as opposed to four-phase signals. So are we that far along in the concepts?
Those are details that would be worked out in a signal design. So when these go to, when the design is determined as far as number of lanes and where the signal poles and all those things are going, when they're determining that design, they are also developing, there'll be a signal technician, oftentimes an electrical engineer, that goes in and times the system in the controller and determines the most efficient way of doing that. ITD has their folks that do that. So that would be nothing on our end or the city's end that would be done. That's ITD and their controller determining what that looks like. Obviously, we made some assumptions on our end to model this of how we believe it should function in its most efficient manner to serve the volume that's going through that and to serve the pedestrians and bikes going through that. But that exact timing that we used will likely be slightly different from what ITD ends up using.
We're gonna talk about a couple specific streets that there's questions on. One, the proposed concept. How does it solve the F rating at Euclid and Highway 2?
Yeah, so the F rating at Euclid and US 2 here is today, it's because of this left turn out of Euclid. And to another extent, sometimes the left turn going into Euclid. I've also seen that back up at times, depending on how much traffic's going east through here. So both of those are causing that level source F condition, and in the short term, as well as the long-term plan, we are restricting that to a right in, right out. So you can only turn right in and you can only turn right out of that street. And that fixes that level source F condition, because you then are only doing right turns. Your left turns are typically your high delay movements, because you're having to wait for two movements to get your gap in there. Whereas a right turn, you're waiting for a single movement, and you can usually shoot that gap a lot quicker than you can in the left turn condition. So that's how that fixes.
Okay. So let's move on to Ella. There's a couple of questions with related concerns about proposed concept and that it will result in increased traffic on Ella.
There is, yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
I was going to pass it to you. You read my mind, so.
It will increase traffic on Ella. It's a dead end today. So creating that connection will put traffic on Ella that is not there today. And that is on purpose, to serve the purpose of the greater transportation network in the hierarchy of streets and creating our connectivity there. It's in the perfect location for another signal. ITD has their stipulations on where they want their signals, given the spacing, number of feet between intersections. And right now, Michigan is not it. And Ella would be your most optimal location for the next signal between Division and Boyer or Pine, because it's kind of that midway point. So you get good progression of your vehicles, that platoon of vehicles that goes through your signal, and hopefully they time them appropriately so they're all coordinated, so that as that platoon reaches your next intersection, they continue to go on. When you get poor spacing, then you start to break up that good progression of traffic. So that's the overall purpose, but yes, it does increase traffic on Ella.
Okay. I think you addressed this in your presentation, but because we have a couple of questions, it's probably good to go back and address this again. Can you talk about the couplet and impacts to pedestrians? So how do they get across that, and how does it impact our community as a walking town?
Amanda, do you want to go to one of those
I think Amanda's fallen asleep.
frozen?
Frozen.
I think before she's fallen asleep.
She's sleeping.
Uh-oh. Wake up.
Let's see, maybe I can take over. Well, I don't know if I can take over, but she's already sharing, but let me try to. Oh, there we go.
And we're getting through here. We're close to the end.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about this again. I know we addressed it several times today around the couplet and the active users, active being pedestrian and bicycle users. So we still have the connection of Church, east and west here, and that will continue to be a crossing. I anticipate crosswalks crossing the couplet on both of these roadways. for pedestrian use and bicycle use. We talked about Oak Street, that middle section will be pedestrian bike only. And then they'll continue on their way east and west in that fashion. And Amanda mentioned the bike facilities anticipated here. This is really your predominant bike movement east and west that gets you to City Beach. We'll continue to have sidewalks both sides of the street on Pine here. Cedar Street remains the way it is with its facilities. So there really isn't any restriction in any pedestrian or bicycle movement here in the Couplet area. And we will have the community path on the one side here paralleling the southbound movement all the way down through this area. Not sure what more to add here. We talked about the potential for hybrid beacons of some sort as protected crossings along Oak Street. I think that probably addresses that.
Okay. I'm gonna ask a safe question that I know will be you because we don't have Amanda back yet. Have there been traffic flow studies to determine where the traffic bottlenecks are?
Yeah, those are coming from the traffic counts. So we have traffic counts that tell us what those existing conditions are. The general traffic volumes, ADT volumes are showing generally what those flows are on an hourly basis to a daily basis. So those are indications. The simulation modeling obviously tells you what that flow is. We calibrate those models to existing conditions to then forecast out to the future with the future volumes to show what those flows are in between intersections.
Why was a northbound on-ramp to US 95 at East Superior not included?
I'm back. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, almost.
Almost? Okay, sorry. I had to connect via my phone. My computer shut down.
Hmm.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sure there are many others that were here during that time that could speak more intelligently to it than I can, but I will at least just say that it is extraordinarily expensive, particularly at this time now that the byway is constructed. It was contemplated when the byway went in, and for a multitude of reasons, cost being one, environmental being another, right-of-way acquisition being another. Quite frankly, it was a feat to get the off-bound ramp onto Superior that we have in place today. So the simple answer is it isn't a realistic consideration.
Okay. Next question, what is the city doing to optimize flow on key secondary roads and arterials?
Preston, do you want to take that? I think there's a variety of definitions of optimum flow, so.
Yeah, so if we look at some of these streets that trying to pick where we want to.
I can give you a couple examples that they cite.
Yeah.
A signal light at Division and Baldy. A signal light at Boyer and Baldy. Or a train underpass, overpass on Boyer.
Yeah, those are all. Yeah, those are all good suggestions and things that were actually looked at and evaluated. So Baldy is one of those key locations that what the plan is trying to do is emphasize that corridor as a good truck route, so that eventually we can get those trucks off of Division, which is where our schools are, and where we're trying not to have a lot of truck traffic and make it more conducive to active transportation users. So as we make those improvements, some of those suggested there on Baldy with the signal at Boyer and the connection over to US 2 with that bridge, that will get us to that point. So that is the end goal, is to make those improvements so we can get trucks there and take them off of Division and transform Division into the street that we all want it to be.
Okay. We have a couple questions about why signalized intersections instead of roundabouts. Mr. Mayor, that was included in the presentation.
Yeah, I
don't
think we
know.
went into a lot of detail there.
Okay. Next one, the city adopted Explore Sandpoint bike routes network for use in town in 2016 with a north-south route on Boyer and an east-west route on Oak, both of which would cross the proposed couplet. Will these two routes continue as established?
Yes.
And can you speak to safety measures?
Safety measures in general have been applied on all these concepts. Many of them we talked through. The safety of bridge and first is partly a safety measure. The couplet itself is a safety measure, reducing conflicts for crossings of pedestrians and bikes at those locations. Division Avenue, we did a roadway safety audit. That was a kind of a separate project done by LTAC, funded by LTAC, I guess I should say, and applied the results of that. Recommendations were applied to this. That is a major safety improvement. Many different improvements. And if you read through the MTMP, there's a synopsis of that roadway safety audit and all the recommendations that are all 100% safety related are all included into that. So that was a big component of that one. And then the access management components on US 2, the either closure of roadways or the restriction of movements on some roadways to right and right outs were all safety related elements.
Okay. Amanda, this one's probably your way. When the city approved the housing development at the former University of Idaho property on Boyer, what discussions and costing was done of train under and overpasses and working with developers to share costs?
That's a great question. So I think it was actually in 2009. I'm sorry, I think it was 2012, right in that area of time where University Place as well. Community, there was an entire analysis done by David Evans and Associates that was paid for by the private property owner back then, to look at how could we have Boyer Avenue cross over, under, around that location of the tracks at Baldy. And I think in total, there were 16 different concepts that were considered at that time. So that information in its entirety, when Fair and Pierce during our planning process, we said, hey, take a look at these, please. OTAC engaged one of their bridge engineers, in fact, solutions, as well as the one that's, can you hear me okay?
Amanda, why don't you
Sorry,
try
Mr.
turning your camera off and see if we can better pick up your audio?
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry for the trouble.
Right.
So again, OTAC actually is also a bridge engineering firm. They have a whole slew of experts across the country, and they looked at a variety of those 16 concepts. They didn't take a full deep dive into costing all of them, but looked at the practicality of implementing them and the costs associated with it. There's a variety of challenges that go into each one of those ideas, whether it's an overpass, an underpass, going around it. And fundamentally, our soil conditions, make it very challenging to do any form of a tunnel application in our jurisdiction, in our area. It's not impossible. There's always a way when there's enough money. However, because especially given the groundwater and the poor soil conditions. However, what I think is probably the biggest hurdle for whether it be an overpass or an underpass in our conversations with OTAC's bridge engineers as well, is the percent of grade, meaning how steep you can go under a road there's requirements about that. And so what we found is actually the point at which you would connect back, whether an overpass or an underpass, is actually back at the tracks that are further to the south, on the south end, which is the Union Pacific tracks. And then again, to the north, you end up being about halfway through the university development, almost to Mountain View. So really large footprint to fit in a bridge or a tunnel at that location. So ultimately what's included in the multimodal plan is a signal at that intersection and providing, one could call it a tunnel, but it's more like a bridge underneath the university or the Union Pacific tracks, I'm sorry, and then connecting into Fifth Avenue. As far, I do want to clarify, I'm sorry, because part of their question was with the recent development of the university place, was that reanalyzed? And the answer is no. What was analyzed is how much volume of traffic as a result of that development needed to contribute to the solution that was already in our multimodal plan, which was a signal. So that developer paid approximately $86,000 to help fund the signal that will eventually go at Baldy and Boyer, as well as they are widening by 3 feet the Boyer Avenue section between Baldy and Mountain View to accommodate a turn pocket, a turn lane in the center for that development. And those costs are on their end.
Okay, I think we, Mr. Mayor, we're down to like 6 questions. I've got a group that are all kind of the same thing. I'll get those together. Next question, why not make Boyer and Highway 2 the entrance to Sandpoint to enhance and make people feel welcome? Think a potential for a gateway concept, perhaps.
I think that through our, the answer I would provide is through our arts and culture master planning effort, as well as our parks and recreation planning effort and our comprehensive plan. I think we as a community probably need to better solidify where our gateways are. I think there are portions of town west of Boyer that would maybe feel a little awkward if that was our gateway when the entrance of town is arguably further to the west. We've had conversations about it Superior and First, or is it Pine and First? Is it Bridge and First? I think that takes a closer look by probably a team that's different than Preston and I.
Okay, we're gonna go downtown now. Why not just make First one way between Cedar and Oak and pinch it down to make 90-degree parking drop-offs and allow folks to see shops with everything else remaining 2-way?
I'm glad you can't see my face with that question. That's a really thoughtful question. And I, from a technical perspective, will hand it off to Preston. I say my face because I'm smiling a little bit. I think many downtowns have found good ways to have one-way traffic through their town. Our community weighed heavily in 2012 to have 2-way traffic throughout First Avenue and Cedar. And for that reason, that's what our concept still includes today, and that's consistent with the feedback we heard during our community engagement process with the multimodal planning effort. And that's what we'll continue to move forward with our downtown revitalization because of that feedback. That I think I'll say this statement, and Preston, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Could it work? Probably.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That was gonna be my response is, yeah, it's an option. It really comes down to what we want. And as part of this process, it was not a consideration based on feedback we'd received from public at the time. And to maintain that 2-way travel and the parking the way it is.
I'll just add, in the Downtown Streets Design Guide from 2012, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. I was part of that group too, and that was certainly part of the discussion. Not First Avenue is one way, but there was definitely discussion about closing First Avenue to vehicle traffic. And there, I think there was ample discussion around it. but at the end of the day, the business community down there weighed in and felt that that would be too negative of an impact. So it's related.
Sidewalks, Amanda, let's do a couple sidewalks. It's noted about Ella being an important street for kids walking to Farman and other schools. If it was made a through street, would sidewalks be installed on both sides from Spruce to Ontario?
Can you say the last part of the question again? I was tracking till the very end. I'm sorry.
If Ella is made a through street, would sidewalks be installed on both sides, Spruce to Ontario?
I think in the long term, that would be ideal. What I can speak to is in recognizing the long-term solution of adding a signal at Ella. The first step is to get it on one side. And currently Ella does not, for majority of its length, particularly north of Pine, does not have sidewalk on either side. So we're really fortunate that the local option tax passed. Ella, in installing new sidewalk in that corridor, is one of our shorter term projects that has been included as a result of voters approving that ballot measure. So placing a sidewalk on one side of Ella is the starting point. Would we like sidewalks on both sides? Quite frankly, of every street in town? Yes. Do we have the money for that? No, but we are strategically planning to address the fact that Ella will likely have more vehicular traffic on it in the future. So that's what I have on that one.
So that's one of our projects highlighted on our website for local option tax. Correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And then second sidewalk question, will sidewalks on the southeast side of Highway 2 from Boyer to Dover be part of the design process?
I think
Southeast.
maybe southwest was the intent, right? If it's to Dover.
Yeah.
That's ideal. Absolutely. I think a multi-use path has been, obviously a priority that's been implemented. The challenges on the south side are all of the businesses and their access points, but we can certainly create sidewalks with connectivity to businesses. So my sense is that at some point, if the data supports that ITD needs to move that project forward, meaning adding a turn lane, for example, in that corridor, we would certainly advocate for our complete streets preference as a community and seek to have sidewalks on the south side as well.
Is that something that ITD would fund or help fund, or would that be solely fall on the city?
I think it's a partnership for sure.
Okay. A couple questions, ITD related. First is level of service scores from ITD. Where are those? Are they posted somewhere? And do those include time of day analysis?
Preston, do you want to take that one?
Oh, if I understand it correctly, I interpret that as the level of service standard or the description of level of service, which is ITD uses the highway capacity manual, the HCM, as their standard. And those standards are on page 54 of the MTMP table 2, which goes through the level of service descriptions by letter grade, a brief description of what those are, and the average delay range between signalized and unsignalized intersections. So that is the basis that every jurisdiction would use who's following the highway capacity manual. And then if you want to get into details of the actual levels of service on these roadways, those are the subsequent pages beyond that, 55 and going forward, 57, go through those details of level of service.
I think I'm gonna add some context to this. I think for what they're looking for is, are those located and updated on some type of a regular basis by ITD? And then do they exist somewhere outside of this point in time from our multimodal plan?
So those standards have been around for as long as I've been alive. Highway capacity manuals included those, and those ranges have not changed as far as I can remember. So those standards are kind of set in stone and are included in the highway capacity manual. Most updated version is the 6th edition of the HCM, and they can be found there. Any description around those?
I think what they're looking at is where they're scoring like an intersection or a section of roadway. And is that happening on a regular basis, and
Are they
those
doing
out there for the
regular
public to
analysis?
find? Yeah.
I'm not aware that they're doing regular updates to analysis on their systems unless there's a problem that a city brings up of, hey, can you guys look at this? And then they relook at them. But I don't believe that they go through and do regular updates to scoring their intersections unless there's an issue brought up to them.
Next question. If the couplet was to be constructed, is there data on the number of commercial trucks that would be routed between the bypass and Highway 2?
Preston, was it around that 11%? Do you remember?
I'm trying to remember what the current ITD estimate is based on their counts, and it's somewhere in that 10 to 15% range of current traffic is heavy truck. And they classify heavy trucks as being like a tow truck and above. But as far as estimations on how that would shift, I don't know how to estimate that. You could probably assume it's a consistent estimation of 10 to 15% would continue along Pine down to First and Superior. Was that the direction they said?
Yep. One at the couplet, yeah.
Or down a couple of, yeah,
Yeah.
you would assume that would stay consistent.
Okay. Here's my last one, and Mr. Mayor and Amanda, I think this will go Amanda's way. And this is consolidating a number of questions so for those who wrote these, you're not going to hear your question exactly as written, but you're all getting at the same thing. ITD doesn't project that the city would, that we reach traffic levels that would require additional capacity on Highway 2 until 2040. Why is the city pursuing this project now when ITD hasn't picked it up off the shelf? We've heard discussion about creating predictability for businesses and those along the corridor. And there is a concern that designs get changed. So fundamentally, why pick this up now?
That's a good question, Mr. Mayor. Do you want me to take that one, or do you want to?
Please do.
I think in our presentation, we answered it, but I'll reiterate it again. It comes in two buckets. Bucket one is ITD and growth and volume. And if we maybe just look the other direction and hope that ITD doesn't check their level of service and growth happens, and maybe this project will just always stay away. So we could keep that bucket to the side for a second. When we launched this multimodal planning effort, as we started the presentation with, it was engaging our community. It wasn't about engaging ITD and what was wrong with their system. It was what are our citizens concerned about? And we listed those in the staff report. We list them in the multimodal plan. We talked about them tonight. We had those 8 points of concerns. It was my first week working for the city 5 years ago that a gentleman and I went on a walkabout, and he wanted to show me how unsafe it was for him to cross Boyer and Highway 2 because of the skewed intersection, and how he almost has a near miss there on a regular basis because he's crossing and someone's looking to their left and doesn't look to the right and sees that he's in the crosswalk. So we've just been hearing that concern for 10, 15 years. So we're picking the project back up because we have unresolved issues where our streets interface with the highway, and we're trying to find solutions to fix them. So we're not trying to pick this conversation back up to advance construction per se. We want to solidify solutions for our citizens on our system that we care about. And the only way to do that is in partnership with ITD, because we have two different jurisdictions working here together. I think the other component I would note is we don't have the funds to design this project, nor would it be viable to design something on someone else's jurisdictional highway. In other words, we could spend $1 million designing our solution without ITD to find that for some reason they don't accept it. And so in this case, it's here's our concept, approach ITD for funding. We hope they'll say yes, or we had hoped. It's ultimately council's decision in that regard to start the feasibility assessment. In other words, here's the city's concept of how to fix our system issues. How much is it going to cost to do that? So ITD running cost analysis on our concept. They have their concept and their design, which is what was presented in 2011 and 2013 that we said we didn't want. So the request is, ITD, could we take this concept and update the design that you did before so that as traffic volumes back now in ITD's bucket, as volumes might increase over time, this is the solution that would be in place. I think the purpose of the modeling back to 2040 and really showing those simulations is my sense is at some point, given the volume, particularly in our peak season, because again, the simulations are non-peak season, is that our citizens are going to be really concerned about congestion. And I think it's critical that when we become concerned about congestion on our system, because as Councilor Welker pointed out, we haven't really provided a good system of network and layers. And he currently has, 100 bad options to get to Winter Ridge. That it's us that's going to be wanting that solution to be implemented, maybe even beforehand. So that was a long-winded answer, and I know it's late, but that's what I got.
No, that was perfect, Amanda. And what a great question to end on, because it really, that's the purpose of why we're all here and what we're here to contemplate. So that's it.
That is a summary of the questions we got both in here in the room as well as online.
Okay. Great. Well, just
Well, I hate to be a barker, but the granary folks just sat here for 5.5 hours, so we could just get one question.
yeah, why don't you come on up?
That we actually emailed you in advance. That is, does the council feel that the multimodal transportation plan, as written, gives staff the authority to solicit funds and promote projects from that plan without further public review? Or is it the kind of public review that we're going to get now, or you've got a multitude of concepts in the multimodal transportation plan? So are we going to be able to say, does council feel like staff can say that the community has vetted all of these and is in support of all of them already?
Yeah, so as was discussed already, these are all bubble diagrams, right? These are cartoons. So before any of these are moved forward anywhere near construction, they would have to go through a design process, a public review process. So there will be multiple.
From the city or from the state? Like, are we going to have a workshop on this phase of development that
Yes.
the city, we are going to have a workshop?
Yeah, there will be plenty of opportunity for public review of any concept that were to move forward towards construction.
Okay, so prior to the August, go to ITD with what our ideas are. We're going to have a community workshop on this proposal.
No, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I thought you're asking no, that's what we're deciding here on May 3rd, right? Is to whether or not to accept this one amendment which would essentially move the intersection at Boyer to the east.
But all the rest of it, we're comfortable.
All the rest of it is already approved, right? And so if your question is around the couplet specifically,
No, it's around the 13 different, programs that are, the concepts that are in appendix A, which this is a part of. Are we saying that those are already completely vetted with the community?
there's
And
no,
the community supports those things when you are soliciting funding.
so right now we have an approved plan with approved concepts. That's what we're sitting with. Those have been approved by the public, by the council with the support of the public. If any of those concepts were to move forward towards design and ultimately construction, in the design process, they would be further vetted by the public. So at any point along the way, take any one of those concepts, there will be a public process like this, where the public has the opportunity to weigh in and the council will decide to what degree to integrate those comments into the final design.
Well, this public process is not really feeling that great to the public. So, I'm just-
Mr. Mayor, can I chime in here for a second, please?
Please do, Amanda.
I'm going to give by way of an example, because I think I understand the question, and I'm going to take it away from US2 and ITD. So on Division Avenue, I think that there is a consensus in our community from our multimodal planning effort for Division. We desire to shrink the footprint of that pavement and really help provide improved connectivity for pedestrians and kids, and all of the results of our road safety audit. That is a corridor our community is on board with improving. The multimodal plan includes a figure for Division Avenue. That gave city staff authority, since we're talking about, what does it really mean to have this adopted multimodal plan? That gave city staff authority to say, hey, there's a child pedestrian safety grant in the pipeline. What projects should city staff be looking at and applying for a grant? So we look through our multimodal plan, we do an assessment of which one of the projects in our capital improvement plan would best fit the criteria for that grant. And we say, okay, child pedestrian safety grant, we think Division would really score high. So we go to city council and they make a decision about whether or not we should even apply for that grant. So it's not a staff decision that just because it's in our multimodal plan that we as staff even have authority to apply for a grant. So step one is, does council approve us asking for money? Step two is council said, yes, you can apply. We got the grant. Go back to council. Council, do we have authority to accept this money? Council says, yes. That's not a staff decision in that regard. Then we get the grant. Council says, yes, you can take this money from the state. And we say, great, we would like to move forward with a design consultant. Division's a really small design because it's a phased project, the one that we're using for the pedestrian grant. So it doesn't require council approve the engineering component of that, meaning the consultant's design. Typically it does because the dollar amount's enough. So we would go back to city council and say, just like we did this evening, is it okay to award a contract to ASLA to do the design for Traverse Park? And council gets to make a decision at that point. Then great, now we have our consultants on board. So they start taking the concept and they start adding details to the concept. Then we go back to the public, which is what we're doing on Division. And we're going to be hosting here in the next couple of weeks, another workshop on that Division Avenue corridor. And we're going to look at our consultants' further details of what's in the concept. We're going to get feedback from the community. And then ultimately, before we go out for bid, we have to go back to council and the public and say, this is what the consultant designed. Can we go out for bid for construction? Get the bids, then we come back to council and we say, are you okay with us awarding this construction contract for this design based upon this price? Do you still want to spend the money? And if the answer is yes, then we move forward with the project. So I lost count, but there are many, many more opportunities, particularly depending upon the complexity of a project, that we are going back at every step along the way to seek public feedback, as well as even authority to apply for money. So while we might be coming forward on May 3rd to request an amendment to this plan, we would be coming back yet again to have a conversation with council and the public once we have a better understanding of cost of this concept with feasibility to go to ITD. And we want you as staff to focus on the wastewater treatment plant, skip August meeting with ITD. They meet every August. We're going to go next year. That's council's decision. So staff, no, we do not have authority to go forward and start asking for money or start spending money without more public engagement on every single concept that is in any of our any of our master plans. Sorry, that's my answer.
Thank you for breaking that down, Amanda. It was a much more thorough answer.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. However, I do want to make a comment. I know how that process works. I know Amanda knows how that process works. With each one of those layers, we have fewer options to comment on. Okay, but when this goes to ITD like that, the transportation corridors are pretty much set. Then we get this word that's like, okay, yeah, we get some public input, but we can't talk about that because that part's already been approved. So we have options over here. And so it just limits our ability, it limits the public's ability to be able to come in and participate in the process. And quite frankly, just historically, there's a couple of things the city fought so hard to get rid of, and then when it went away, we all just breathed a sigh of relief, because it was really those three choices that we got from ITD when they were shoving it down our throat was like, we needed to vote for one, A, B, or C. And we voted for couplet because that was the lesser of the three evils, right? And then when that all went away, the traffic calmed, I really feel like, maybe it's a community, maybe it's a COVID community, but I'm not sure how many people actually participated in the transportation plan. And so that's where I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling like this is what it felt like in 2015 when ITD came and said, we're coming, get ready. You got your choice A, B, or C. And that's kind of what it feels like now. So, and I think a lot of the general public is feeling that because there are a lot of people and a lot of business owners that are going like, oh my God, this is really on our doorstep now. We have to pay attention. And now we're only finding out that we might even be able to have a public hearing. So that's, that part's just for
Thank you for your comments. With that, this meeting is adjourned at 10:45. I want to thank our consultant Preston Stinger from Fairs and Peers for being here this evening. Thank you, Preston. Really appreciate it. Thank you, city staff, for all the work that you did putting this workshop together, and members of the public for your participation. Thank you, council. It was a long one.